Hello. Hello, hello. How's it going? Good to see you all. As always, it is a treat that I can hop on here and just read and that people hang out, and that's just really cool. So, hello. Good to see you. Hope your day is going pretty great. And if it's not, stick around. Hopefully it'll get better. I have the the babiest of reading updates. I read one page of Akira Volume 2 today and then realized that I had other things to do, so I had to put it down. But I checked out Perfume, The Story of a Murderer by Patrick Suskind. It has an umlaut. I, unless it's Motley Crue, I don't know how to say umlauts. Um, but by Patrick Susskind, and it is a chat recommended book. So I will be starting this tomorrow during reading sprints, and I'm really excited about that. Hey, Honey Lemon. I know that got my attention too. And something else. So this, at least this edition, came out in 2001, and the library has 6 copies. But I still had to put like a hold on it. I still had to be on a wait list. They were all checked out, and I like murderer wait list. It it must be good. It must be. Let's see how many pages there are. I think it's under 300. Yeah, 255. Easy peasy, lemon squeezy, mac and cheesy, however you want to end that. So I'm excited to start this and see. I don't know anything about it except that it is the story of a murderer. So we'll see. I have high hopes. The same person who recommended this also recommended a 5-star read for me earlier in the year. So again, so many high hopes for this book. So I'm excited to do that. But today we are continuing, as I get further and further from the microphone, we are continuing with Don Quixote. We are on part 2. We are about to start chapter 15. We're on page 548, and we still got a long way to go. Look, a long way, but we're over halfway visibly, and it's so exciting. Okay, so let's see what happened last time. Oh, yes, I remember. So let's see where we left off, though. Hold on, because I don't want to say things that happened that didn't actually happen. Okay, let's see. Okay, cool. Yes. So Don Quixote and Sancho Panza have started their third journey, and they have decided that they are going to go to Toboso and find Lady Dulcinea. So, Sancho Panza has never seen Lady Dulcinea, neither has Don Quixote. But a while ago, Don Quixote gave a message to Sancho to deliver to Dulcinea. And he never made it, but he said that he did, and he returned a message from her. And so they go to Toboso, they make it, and they're like, okay, where is she? Like, go find her. And Sancho is like, has this whole ruse where he has Don Quixote waiting outside of Toboso, and he's like, I'm gonna find her and let her know that you're here, like that sort of thing. And so he sees these like peasant girls riding donkeys in the streets, and he's like, these are gonna be the ones. And so he goes and tells Don Quixote that he found her and she's riding in the streets with her servants. And they go there, and they are visibly like not upper crust people. And Don Quixote is like, I don't think this is her. I don't think this is the most beautiful woman in all of the land. And Sancho convinces Don Quixote that, yeah, it is, but remember all those enchanters that are like working with your mind to make you see other things? That's what's happening. It really is her, but you're just seeing this peasant girl. So they have like a super weird interaction between Don Quixote and these three women. And the three women do leave, and it's just like a weird situation. But they do leave, and Don Quixote and Sancho like continue on their journey, and they come across another knight, the Knight of the Mirror. And this Knight of the Mirror also has a squire, and we're listening to the knight talking to himself or to the squire, we're not really sure, but just like mumbling about the love of his life and all of these things, and that he is the only knight around, and he even beat the great Don Quixote. And Don Quixote is like, that's not true. I am Don Quixote. Wait a minute. And so the squires chat and the knights chat. And the knights decide that in the morning they are going to joust. And whoever wins gets to set the terms for the loser. And they do their thing. Don Quixote somehow wins. The Knight of the Mirror falls on his back, hurts himself, and he is the bachelor that we met before. I forgot his name, Carrasco, but I forgot his first name. Guess it doesn't matter. But it's actually him and like his neighbor. His neighbor is the squire, and they were just doing this so that if they won, that Don Quixote would go back to the village. Maybe. So that's where we left off, and the next portion is actually going to be talking about the Knight of the Mirrors and his squire. So I think we're gonna get the other side of this. So we'll see. We'll see. Hey Duddy, how's it going? Good to see you. All right. Let's just jump right in. Oh, good, good, good. Good. Let me cross my legs. Crisscross applesauce. Oof. Why do we say applesauce? How come not like crisscross tartar sauce or something? Dr. Westvig, thank you so much for the follow. Oh, yes. Tears of the Kingdom. So close. It is almost here. You can almost taste it. Yeah, that's definitely going to be taking over the weekend over here. We're prep. Hello. Thank you for the follow. My favorite color? See, that's hard. I really like purple. I know you would think it was green since I look extremely green today. My pronouns are she, her. Thank you so much for asking. I know, I know. Oh, yours is purple as well. Amazing. All right, let's hop right on in. Chapter 15, which recounts and relates the identity of the Knight of the Mirrors and his squire. Don Quixote was filled with contentment, pride, and vainglory at having achieved victory over so valiant a knight as he imagined the Knight of the Mirrors to be. And from his chivalric promise he hoped to learn if the enchantment of his lady was still in effect, since it was necessary for the conquered knight to return, under pain of no longer being a knight, to tell him what had transpired with her. But Don Quixote thought one thing, and the Knight of the Mirrors thought another, for his only thought then was to find a place where he could apply a plaster, as has already been said. Captain Hardship, good to see you. Absolutely, Daddy. Don Quixote would 1000% play Tears of the Kingdom and then need to go save Zelda. And so, the history tells us that when Bachelor Sansón Carrasco advised Don Quixote to return to the chivalric undertakings he had abandoned, it was because he first had spoken privately with the priest and the barber regarding the steps that could be taken to prevail upon Don Quixote to remain quietly and peacefully at home and not be disturbed by ill-fated adventures. And the decision of this meeting was, by unanimous vote, and the particular support of Carrasco, that they would allow Don Quixote to leave, since it seemed impossible to stop him, and that Sanson, as a knight-errant, would meet him on the road and engage in combat with him. For there was no lack of reasons to fight, and he would vanquish him, on the assumption that this would be an easy thing to do, and it would be agreed and accepted that the vanquished would be at the mercy of the victor. And when Don Quixote had been vanquished, the bachelor knight would order him to return to his village and his house, and not leave again for 2 years, or until he had commanded otherwise. It was clear that the vanquished Don Quixote would undoubtedly obey in order not to contravene or disrespect the laws of chivalry, and it might be that in the time of his seclusion he would forget his illusions, or a worthwhile remedy would be found to cure his madness. Can I start from the beginning? Oh my gosh. We're on page 549. We don't got time for that. Carrasco agreed, and Tomé Cecial, Sancho Panza's compadre and neighbor, and a cheerful, light-hearted man, volunteered to be his squire. Sanson armed himself in the manner described, and Tomé Cecial placed on his natural nose the false nose already referred to, so that his compadre would not recognize him when they met. They followed the same route taken by Don Quixote, and they almost arrived in time to take part in the adventure of the cart of death. Finally, they met in the wood, where everything the prudent reader has just read happened to them, and if it had not been for Don Quixote's extraordinary ideas that led him to believe the bachelor was not the bachelor, Señor Bachelor would have been forever incapable of receiving his licentiate degree, for he thought he would find birds, and did not even find nests. Tomé Cecial, who saw how badly their plans had turned out, and how unfortunately their journey had ended, said to the bachelor, "Certainly, Señor Sanson Carrasco, we've forgotten what we deserved. It's easy enough to think up and begin an enterprise, but most of the time it's hard to end it. Don Quixote's crazy, we're sane, and he walks away healthy and laughing, while your grace is bruised and sad. So tell me now, who's crazier? The man who's crazy because he can't help it, or the man who chooses to be crazy?" To which Sanson responded, "The difference between those two madmen is that the one who can't help it will always be mad, and the one who chooses can stop whenever he wants to." "Well, that's true," said Tomé Cecial. "I chose to be crazy when I decided to become your grace's squire, and by the same token, I want to stop now and go back home." "That may be convenient for you," responded Sanson, "but if you think I'll go back to mine before I've given Don Quixote a good beating, then you are sadly mistaken. I moved now not by the desire to help him recover his sanity, but by the desire for revenge. The terrible pain in my ribs does not allow me to speak more piously." The two men conversed in this manner until they reached a village where they happened to find a bone setter, who cured the unfortunate Sanson. Tomé Cecial turned back and left him, and Sanson remained behind to imagine his revenge, and the history speaks of him again at the proper time, but it joyfully returns now to Don Quixote. Very short chapter. That was the end of chapter 15. So we got the other side, and it is confirmed that Sanson convinced and inspired Don Quixote and Sancho to leave on their third adventure so that they could convince them later to stay home. It's such a ruse. It's wild. Oh, Geely Olive, thank you so much for the follow. So, yeah, so their idea was they're going to let them go, and then they will defeat them in battle as a knight, And because they win, then Sanson will tell Don Quixote and Sancho, all right, I've won. You now have to go back home and never leave. And you need to leave knight-errantry, which is wild to me. So, there you go. Mongu? Oh, it means hello. Hello. All right. Chapter 16. Regarding what befell Don Quixote with the prudent knight of La Mancha. With the joy, contentment, and pride that have already been mentioned, Don Quixote continued his journey, imagining, because of his recent victory, that he was the world's most valiant knight-errant of the age. He considered any adventures that might befall him from that time on as already completed, and brought to a happy conclusion. He held enchantments and enchanters in contempt. He did not recall the countless beatings he had received in the course of his chivalric exploits, or the stones that had knocked out half his teeth, or the ingratitude of the galley slaves, or the Yanginson's audacious rainstorm of staffs. In short, he said to himself that if he could find the art, means, or manner to disenchant his lady Dulcinea, he would not envy the greatest good fortune that ever was achieved, or could be achieved by the most fortunate knight-errant of past times. He was completely lost in these thoughts when Sancho said, "Isn't it funny, señor, that I can still see the awful outsized nose of my compadre Tome Cecial? Do you believe, Sancho, that the Knight of the Mirrors was bachelor Carrasco, and your compadre Tome Cecial was his squire?" "I don't know what to say about that," responded Sancho. "All I know is that he was the only one who could have told me what he did about my house, my wife, and my children, and except for the nose, his face was the face of Tome Cecial, just as I have seen it so often in my village, and in his house that shares a wall with mine, and the sounds of his voice was the same." "Let us reason about this, Sancho," replied Don Quixote. "Come, does it make sense that bachelor Sanson Carrasco could appear as a knight-errant, armed with offensive and defensive weapons to do battle with me? Have I, by chance, been his enemy? Have I ever given him reason to bear me ill will? Am I his rival, or does he profess arms, that he would be envious of the fame I have won through their exercise?" "But what do we say, señor," responded Sancho, "about that knight, whoever he was, looking so much like bachelor Carrasco, and his squire looking like my compadre, Tome Cecial? If it's enchantment, like your grace says, weren't there any other men in the world they could have looked like?" "Everything is artifice and mere appearance," responded Don Quixote, "devised by the evil magicians who pursue it. Foreseeing that I would emerge victorious from the battle, they arranged for the defeated knight to show the face of my friend the bachelor, so that the friendship I have for him would be placed between the edges of my sword, and stay the severity of my arm, and temper the righteous anger of my heart. And in this manner, the one who was attempting to take my life through trickery and falsehood would save his own. As proof of this you already know, O Sancho, through experience that will not allow you to lie or deceive, how easy it is for enchanters to transform one face into another, making the beautiful ugly and the ugly beautiful. No more than 2 days ago you saw with your own eyes the beauty and grace of the peerless Dulcinea in all her natural perfection and harmony, and I saw her as an ugly, low-born peasant girl, with cataracts in her eyes, and a foul smell in her mouth. Further, if the perverse enchanter dared to make so evil a transformation, it is not difficult to believe that he transformed Sanson Carrasco and your compadre in order to steal the glory of conquest right out of my hands. But, despite this, I am comforted, because in the end, regardless of his shape and appearance, I have conquered my enemy." "Hey, Star, good to see you." "God knows the truth of all things," responded Sancho. and since he knew that the transformation of Dulcinea had been his own trickery and deception, the chimerical ideas of his master did not satisfy him. But he did not wish to respond so as not to say anything that might reveal his lie. They were engaged in this conversation when they were overtaken by a man riding behind them on the same road, mounted on a very beautiful, dapper mare, and wearing a coat of fine green cloth, trimmed with tawny velvet, and a cap made of the same velvet. The mare's trappings, in the rustic style and with a short stirrup, were also purple and green. He wore a Moorish scimitar hanging from a wide green and gold sword belt, and his half-boots matched his sword belt. His spurs were not gilt, but touched with a green varnish, so glossy and polished that, since they matched the rest of his clothing, they looked better than if they had been made of pure gold. When the traveler reached them, he greeted them courteously, and spurred his mare in order to pass by. But Don Quixote said, "Gallant Señor, if your grace is traveling the same road, and is not in a hurry, I would be very pleased if we traveled together." "The truth is," responded the man on the mare, "that I would not ride by so quickly if it were not for my fear that the presence of my mare might disturb your horse." "Señor," Sancho responded at this point, "you can certainly tighten your mare's reins, because our horse is the most chaste, best behaved horse in the world. On similar occasions he has never done anything low or base, and once when he was rude enough to try, my master and I made him pay for it 7 times over. I say again that your grace can stop if you want to, because even if she's brought to him on a silver platter, I'm sure our horse won't even look at your mare in the face." The traveler pulled on his reins, marveling at the bearing and face of Don Quixote, who rode without his sallet helmet, which Sancho had hung like a bag over the forebow on the donkey's pack saddle. And if the man in green looked at Don Quixote a great deal, Don Quixote looked even more at the man in green, thinking him a virtuous and judicious person. He seemed to be about 50, with few gray hairs and an aquiline face. His aspect was both cheerful and grave. In short, his dress and bearing made it clear that he was a man of good qualities. The judgment of the man in green with regard to Don Quixote of La Mancha was that he had never seen anyone like him in manner or appearance. He was amazed by the length of his horse, his height, his thin, sallow face, his weapons, his bearing and behavior, a form and appearance not seen for many years in that land. Don Quixote noticed how attentively the traveler was looking at him, and read his desires in his astonishment. And since Don Quixote was courteous, and wished to please everyone, before the traveler could ask anything he met him halfway, saying, "Your grace has noticed my appearance, which is so unusual and far removed from what is commonly seen, that I am surprised at your surprise. I am not surprised at your surprise, but your grace will no longer be so when I tell you, as I do now, that I am a knight, the kind, as people say, who go to seek adventures. I left my home, mortgaged my estate, left behind my comfort, and threw myself into the arms of fortune, so that she may carry me wherever she chooses. I have desired to revive a long-dead knight-errantry, and for many days stumbling here, falling there, dropping down in one place and standing up in another, I have fulfilled a good part of my desire, helping widows, protecting maidens, favoring married women, orphans, and wards, which is the proper and natural work of knights-errant. Because of my many worthy Christian deeds, I have deserved to be published in almost all or most of the nations in the world. 30,000 copies of my history have been printed, and 30,000 times more are on their way to being printed if heaven does not intervene. Briefly, then, to summarize everything in a few words, or in only one, I say that I am Don Quixote of La Mancha, also known as the Knight of the Sorrowful Face, and although praising oneself is vile, I am obliged, perhaps, to sing my own praises, which is understandable since there is no one present to do it for me. And so, Señor, neither this horse nor this lance, this shield nor this squire, nor all of my armor, nor my sallow face and extreme thinness, none of this should surprise you now, for I have told you who I am, and the profession I follow. Don Quixote fell silent when he said this, and the man in green took so long to respond that it seemed he did not know what to say. But after some time he said, "You are correct, Señor Knight, in deducing my desire from my surprise, but you have not taken away the astonishment that seeing you has caused me, for, although, Señor, you say my knowing who you are will take it away, that has not happened. Rather, now that I know, I am more amazed and astonished than before. How is it possible that there are knights-errant in the world today, or that there are printed histories of true knightly deeds? I can't convince myself that anyone in the world today favors widows, protects maidens, honors married women, and helps orphans, and I wouldn't believe it if I hadn't seen it in your grace with my own eyes. Heaven be praised. With the history that your grace says has been published about your lofty and true chivalric feats, the countless tales of imaginary knights-errant will be forgotten, for they have filled the world, harming good customs and damaging and discrediting good histories." "There is much to say," responded Don Quixote, "regarding whether the histories of knights-errant are imaginary or not." "Well, who can doubt," said the man in green, "that those histories are false?" "I doubt it," responded Don Quixote, "and let us say no more. If our journey together is a long one, I hope to God to convince your grace that you have erred in going along with those who are certain they are not true." From this last statement of Don Quixote's, the traveler assumed he must be a simpleton, and he waited to see if any further statements would confirm this. But before they could engage in other conversation, Don Quixote asked him to say who he was, for he had informed him of his circumstances and his life, to which the man in the green coat, responded, "I, Señor Knight of the sorrowful face, am a gentleman who is a native of the village where, God willing, we shall have our dinner today. I am more than moderately wealthy, and my name is Don Diego de Miranda. I spend my time with my wife and my children and my friends. My pastimes are hunting and fishing, but I keep neither hawk nor greyhounds, only some tame decoy partridges or a few bold ferrets. I have some 6 dozen books, some in Castilian and some in Latin, some historical and some devotional. Books of chivalry have not yet crossed my threshold. I read more profane books than devout ones, as long as the diversion is honest and the language delights, and the invention amazes and astounds, though there are very few of those in Spain. From time to time I dine with my friends and neighbors, and often I invite them to my table. My meals are carefully prepared and nicely served, in no way meager. I don't like gossip, and I don't allow it in my presence. I don't meddle in other people's lives, and I don't pry into what other people do. I hear Mass every day. I distribute alms to the poor, but do not boast of doing good works, so as not to allow hypocrisy and vainglory into my heart, for they are enemies that can easily take possession of the most modest heart. I attempt to bring peace to those whom I know are quarreling. I am devoted to Our Lady, and trust always in the infinite mercy of the Lord our God. Apatsura, hello, good to see you. Thank you for the follow. Sancho was very attentive to this recounting of the life and pastimes of the gentleman, and finding it a good and saintly life, and thinking that the man who led it must be able to perform miracles, he quickly dismounted the donkey and hurried to grasp the gentleman's right stirrup, and with a devout heart, and almost in tears, he kissed his feet over and over again. Seeing this, the gentleman asked, "What are you doing, brother? What is the reason for these kisses?" "Let me give them to you," responded Sancho, "because I think your grace is the first saint with short stirrups that I've ever seen in my life." "I'm not a saint," responded the gentleman, "but a great sinner. But you, brother, must be a good man. Your simplicity proves it." Sancho returned to his pack saddle, having moved his master to laughter despite his profound melancholy, and causing Don Diego even more amazement. Don Quixote asked how many children he had, and said that among the things that ancient philosophers, who lacked a true knowledge of God, considered the highest good were the riches of nature, worldly goods, and having many friends and many good children. Stevie, thank you so much for the follow. Good to see you. "I, Señor Don Quixote," responded the gentleman, "have a son, and if I didn't have him, perhaps I could consider myself more fortunate than I do, and not because he's bad, but because he isn't as good as I would like him to be. He's 18, and has spent the last 6 years in Salamanca studying Latin and Greek, and when I wanted him to go on to study other areas of knowledge, I found him so enthralled with poetry, if that can be called knowledge, that I can't make him show any enthusiasm for law, which I would like him to study, or for the queen of all study, which is theology. I would like him to be the crown of his lineage, for we live in a time when our kings richly reward good, virtuous letters, for letters without virtue are pearls in the dung heap. He spends the whole day determining if Homer wrote well or badly in a particular line of the Iliad. If Martial was indecent in a certain epigram, if specific lines of Virgil are to be understood in this manner or short. In short, all his conversations are about the books of those poets, and of Horace, Persius, Juvenal, and Tibullus. He does not think very highly of modern writers, and despite the antipathy he displays toward poetry in the vernacular, his thoughts are now entirely turned to writing a gloss on 4 lines sent to him from Salamanca, I think for literary competition. Clapple clapple. Oh man, I totally said your name wrong, but thank you so much for the follow. Good to see you. To which Don Quixote responded, "Children, señor, are the very apple of their parents' eyes, and whether they are good or bad, they are loved as we love the souls that give us life. From the time they are little, it is the obligation of parents to guide them along the paths of virtue, good breeding, and good Christian customs, so that when they are grown, they will be a support in the old age of their parents, and the glory of their posterity. I do not think it is wise to force them to study one thing or another, although persuading them to do so would not be harmful. And when there is no need to study pene lucrando, if the student is so fortunate that heaven has endowed him with parents who can spare him that, it would be my opinion that they should allow him to pursue the area of knowledge to which they can see he is inclined. Although poetry is less useful than pleasurable, it is not one of those that dishonors the one who knows it." And there is a footnote after pene lucrando, and it says, the phrase means in order to earn one's bread. Poetry, señor, in my opinion, is like an innocent young maiden who is extremely beautiful, and whom many other maidens, who are the other fields of knowledge, are careful to enrich, polish, and adorn, and she must be served by all of them, and all of them must encourage her. But this maiden does not wish to be pawned or dragged through the streets, or proclaimed at the corners of the squares or in the corners of palaces. Her alchemy is such that the person who knows how to treat her will turn her into purest gold of inestimable value. The man has her. The man who has her must keep her within bounds and not allow her to turn to indecent satires or cruel sonnets. She should never be in the marketplace except in heroic poems, heartfelt tragedies, or joyful, witty comedies. She should not be allowed in the company of scoundrels or the ignorant mob of incapable of knowing or appreciating the treasures that lie within her. And do not think, Signor, that when I say mob I mean only humble, plebeian people, for anyone who is ignorant, even a lord and prince, can and should be counted as one of the mob. And so the man who uses and treats poetry in the requisite ways that I have mentioned will be famous, and his name esteemed in all the civilized nations of the world. And as for what you have said, Signor, regarding your son's lack of esteem for poetry in the modern languages, it is my understanding that he is mistaken. For this reason, the great Homer did not write in Latin because he was Greek, and Virgil did not write in Greek because he was Latin. In short, all the ancient poets wrote in their mother tongues, and they did not look for foreign languages in order to declare the nobility of their ideas. And this being true, it is reasonable to extend this custom to all nations, and not to despise the German poet because he writes in his own language, or the Castilian, or even the Basque, for writing in his. But I imagine, Senor, that your son does not condemn vernacular poetry, but poets who are merely vernacular, and do not know other languages or other fields of knowledge, which adorn and awaken and assist their natural impulses. Even in this he may be mistaken, because, according to reliable opinion, a poet is born. That is to say, the natural poet is a poet when he comes from his mother's womb, and with that inclination granted to him by heaven, with no further study or artifice, he composes things that prove the truthfulness of the man who said, Est dies in nobis. I also say that the natural poet he makes use of art will be a much better and more accomplished poet than the one who knows only the art and wishes to be a poet. The reason is that art does not surpass nature, but perfects it. Therefore, when nature is mixed with art, and art with nature, the result is a perfect poet. And there is a note after ist Deus in nobis, and it says the phrase God is in us is by Ovid. Let the kid learn poetry. Exactly. If the kid wants to learn poetry, let the kid learn poetry. Nice guy Stevie, yes. So Don Quixote is convinced that he is a knight-errant, and so a lot of the times when he is speaking, he's speaking in that sort of fashion. And we'll get more examples of this where he adds like eth and if, like speaketh and bringeth and stuff like that to a lot of words. And also, this is a translation. The book was originally written in Spanish and translated to English. So yeah, there are some parts where it's a little bit like, what? And Don Quixote as a character is just overly wordy. Absolutely. Yes, Rob, good to see you. Let me conclude by saying, Senor, that you should allow your son to walk the path to which his star calls him, if he is the good student he should be, and if he has already successfully climbed the first essential step, which is languages. With them he will, on his own, mount to the summit of human letters, which are so admirable in a gentleman with his cape and sword, and adorn, honor, and ennoble him, as meters do bishops, or robes the learned jurists. Your grace should reprimand your son if he writes satires that damage other people's honors. You should punish him and tear up the poems, but if he composes admonitory sermons in the manner of Horace, in which vices in general are elegantly reproved, then praise him, because it is licit for the poet to write against envy, and to criticize the envious in his verses, and to do the same with the other vices, as long as he does not point out a specific person. But there are poets who, for the sake of saying something malicious, would run the risk of being exiled to the lands of Pontus. And we have two notes in that very long sentence. The first one is after, in the manner of Horace, and it says the reference is to satires of Horace. And then the second one is after exiled to the islands of Pontus, and it says Augustus exiled Ovid to these islands in the Black Sea. If the poet is chaste in his habits, he will be chaste in his verses as well. The pen is the tongue of the soul. His writings will be like the concepts engendered here, when knights and princes see the miraculous art of poetry in prudent, virtuous, and serious subjects they honor, esteem, and enrich them, and even crown them with the leaves of the tree that lightning never strikes, as a sign that those whose temples are honored and adorned by such crowns are not to be assailed by anyone. And there is another note after lightning never strikes, and it says the allusion is to the Lord. The gentleman in the green coat was so amazed at Don Quixote's words that he began to change his mind about his having to be a simpleton. But because it was not very much to his liking, in the middle of his speech Sancho had turned off the road to request a little milk from some shepherds who were milking their sheep nearby, and in the meantime, just as the gentleman was about to resume the conversation, satisfied in the extreme as to Don Quixote's intelligence and good sense, Don Quixote looked up and saw that coming down the road where they had been traveling was a wagon bearing royal banners, and believing that this must be some new adventure, he called to Sancho to bring him his helmet. And Sancho, hearing his shouts, left the shepherds and spurred his donkey and rushed to his master, who was about to engage in a terrifying and reckless adventure. End of chapter 16. All right, so yeah, basically that whole spiel that Don Quixote went through was like, yeah, if he wants to do poetry and study poetry, let him study poetry. It sounds like he's doing a good job. You should be praising him. Oh, that's so funny. Yeah, Don Quixote just, I'm pretty sure he just loves to hear himself speak. Loves the sound of his own voice. That's what I'm pretty sure is going on here. And I think it's so funny that Sancho, in the middle of all of this happening, is like, this doesn't really concern me. There's some shepherds. I think I'm gonna go see if I can get some milk from them. Just like leaves, wanders away from the conversation. I think that's so funny. And very much in Sancho's character, too. Very much. Yeah, he's totally a windbag. Absolutely. And it's so funny because I remember like very early on when he was talking to Sancho, he was like, just don't lecture to me, okay? Just keep it short and simple. And literally every time Don Quixote talks, it's just paragraphs and paragraphs, pages, just lecturing. Anyone and everyone, honestly. He would probably lecture goats if he wanted to, if he was left to it. Boy. All right, but now let's see what he's gonna get himself involved in with this new company that's heading down the road. Chapter 17. In which the heights and extremes to which the remarkable courage of Don Quixote could and did go is revealed, along with the happily concluded adventure of the lions. I'm intrigued. The history recounts that when Don Quixote called to Sancho to bring him his helmet, The squire was in the midst of buying curds from the shepherd, and flustered by his master's great urgency, he did not know what to do with them, or where to carry them, and in order not to lose them, since he had already paid for them, he placed them in the helmet. I'm so excited to see what happens. He just puts them in the helmet. Okay. Having made this provision, he went back to see what his master wanted, and as soon as he approached, Don Quixote said, "Friend, hand me my helmet, for either I know very little about adventures, or what I see there is one that will, and does, oblige me to take up arms." The gentleman in the green coat heard this, and looked all around, and saw nothing but a wagon coming toward them, with 2 or 3 small flags on it, which led him to assume it was carrying currency that belonged to his majesty, and he told this to Don Quixote, who did not accept what he said, for he always believed and thought that everything that happened to him had to be adventures and more adventures, and so he responded to the gentleman, "Forewarned is forearmed. Nothing is lost by cautioning me, although I know from experience that I have visible and invisible enemies, and I do not know when, or where, or how, or in what guise they will attack me." And turning to Sancho, he asked for his sallet helmet. Sancho did not have time to take out the curds, and was obliged to hand him the helmet just as it was. Don Quixote took it, and without even glancing at what might be inside, he quickly placed it on his head. Since the curds were pressed and squeezed together, the whey began to run down Don Quixote's face and beard, which startled him so much that he said to Sancho, "What can this be, Sancho? It seems as if my head is softening, or my brains are melting, or that I am bathed in perspiration from head to foot. And if I am perspiring, the truth is that it is not because of fear, although I undoubtedly must believe that the adventure about to befell me will be a terrible one. Give me something, if you have it, that I can use to wipe away this copious perspiration, for it is blinding me." So he is having just curds running down his face, and instead of thinking that there's something in the helmet, thinks that maybe he's really sweaty. Maybe his brains are mushing, and he just needs to wipe it away real quick. Oh my gosh. Okay. Sancho remained silent and gave him a cloth, and with it he gave his thanks to God that his master had not detected the truth. Don Quixote wiped his face and took off his helmet to see what it was that seemed to be chilling his head, and seeing that white mush inside, he brought the helmet up to his nose and smelled it. He said, "By the life of my lady Dulcinea of Toboso, these are curds that you have placed in here, you traitorous, shameless, discourteous squire." To which, the great aplomb and dissimulation, Sancho responded, "If those are curds, your grace should give them to me and I'll eat them. But let the devil eat them, because he must be the one who put them there. Would I ever dare to dirty your grace's helmet? You must know who the scoundrel is. By my faith, señor, and the brains God gave me, I must also have enchanters who pursue me, since I'm your grace's servant and one of your members. And they must have put that filth there to turn your patience to anger and move you to beat me around my ribs, as you so often do. But the truth is that this time they're far off the mark, for I trust in the good sense of my master, who will consider that I don't have any curds, or milk, or anything else along those lines, and if I did, I'd put them in my stomach, and not in your salad helmet." Oh, this is so wild. "All things are possible," said Don Quixote. And the gentleman observed all of this, and all of it amazed him, especially when Don Quixote, after carefully cleaning his head, face, beard, and sallet, steadied his feet in the stirrups, called for his sword, grasped his lance, and said, "Now come what may, for here I am, ready to do battle with Satan himself." At this moment, the wagon with the flags reached them, and the only people on it were the driver, leading the mules, and a man sitting at the front. Don Quixote stopped in front of the wagon and said, "Where are you going, brothers? What wagon is this, and what are you carrying in it, and what flags are these?" To which the driver responded, "The wagon is mine. Inside are 2 fierce lions in cages that the General of Oran is sending to court as a present for his majesty. The flags belong to our master, the king, as a sign that what's inside is his." "Are the lions big?" asked Don Quixote. "So big," responded the man riding at the door of the wagon, "but no lions bigger, or even as big, have ever been brought over from Africa to Spain. I'm the lion keeper, and I've brought over other lions, but none like these. They're male and female, the males in this cage and the females in the one behind, and they're hungry now because they haven't eaten today, and so, your grace, move out of the way, because we have to hurry to the place where we can feed them." To which Don Quixote, smiling slightly, said, "You talk of lions to me? To me you speak of these little lions, and at this hour? Well, by God, those gentlemen who sent them here will see if I am a man who is frightened by lions. Get down, my good man, and since you are the lion keeper, open these cages and bring out those beasts, for in the middle of these fields I shall let them know who Don Quixote of La Mancha is, in spite of and in defiance of the enchanters who have sent them to me." "Well, that proves it," said the gentleman to himself. "Our good knight has shown exactly who he is. The curds, no doubt, have softened his head and ripened his brains." At this moment, Sancho came up to him and said, "Señor, for the love of God, your grace, do something to stop my master, Don Quixote, from doing battle with these lions. If he fights them, they'll tear us all to pieces." "Well, is your master so crazy," responded the gentleman, "that you fear and believe he'll fight with such savage animals?" "He isn't crazy," responded Sancho. "He's just reckless." "I'll do what I can to keep him from daring too much," replied the gentleman, and going up to Don Quixote, who was urging the lion keeper to open the cages, he said, "Señor Knight, knights-errant ought to undertake adventures that promise some hope of success, not those that are completely devoid of hope, for the valor that crosses over into temerity has more to do with madness than courage, particularly because these lions are not attacking your grace, or even dreaming of doing so. They are gifts to his majesty, and it would not be wise to stop them or interfere with their journey." "Señor," responded Don Quixote, "your grace should go and see to your tame decoy partridge and your bold ferret, and let each man do his work. This is mine, and I know whether or not these noble lions are attacking me." And turning to the lion keeper, he said, "I swear, Don Scoundrel, that if you do not open the cages immediately, I shall pin you to the wagon with this lance." The driver, who saw the determination of that armed apparition, said, "Señor, if it pleases your grace, I beg you, let me unyoke the mules and take them somewhere safe before the lions show themselves, because if they kill them, I'll be ruined for life. The only thing I own is this wagon and these mules." "Oh, man of little faith," responded Don Quixote, "get down and unyoke them, and do whatever you wish, for soon you will see that you labored in vain and could have spared yourself the effort." The driver climbed down and quickly unyoked the mules, and the lion keeper cried out, "Let all those here present bear witness that I have been forced against my will to open the cages and set free the lions, and that I declare to this gentleman that he is answerable and accountable for all the harm and damage these beasts may do, as well as for my salaries and fees. Your graces should take cover before I let them out, though I'm sure they won't hurt me. I also foresee this going very badly, but I also see something happening where, like, Don Quixote trips and somehow is able to, I don't know, subdue the lions. I don't know. Like, whatever happens, if Don Quixote is successful, I think it's going to be by complete accident. But totally, it's totally gonna go bad. Once again, the gentleman tried to persuade him not to commit an act of madness, for to engage in something so foolish was to tempt God, to which Don Quixote responded that he knew what he was doing. The gentleman responded that he should be careful, for he knew that Don Quixote was deceived. Oh, or secondhand lions thing. Yes. Ooh. Yes. Now, señor, replied Don Quixote, if your grace does not wish to be a witness to what you believe is going to be a tragedy, use your spurs on the dapple and hurry to safety. Hearing this, Sancho, with tears in his eyes, begged his master to desist from such an undertaking, compared to which the adventure of the windmills and that of the water wheels, and, in short, all the feats he had performed in the entire course of his life, had been nothing but child's play. Look, señor, said Sancho, there's no enchantment here or anything like that. I've seen through the gratings and cracks in the cage and the claws of a real lion, and I think the lion that claw belongs to must be bigger than a mountain. You fear, at the very least, responded Don Quixote, will make it seem bigger to you than half the world. Withdraw, Sancho, and leave me. If I die here, you know our old agreement. You will present yourself to Dulcinea, and I shall say no more to you. To these words he added others with which he took away all hope that he might not pursue his mad intention. The gentleman in the green coat would have liked to stop him, but he was not as well armed, and he did not think it prudent to fight with madmen, for by now he thought Don Quixote was completely out of his mind. The knight again began to press the lion keeper and to repeat his threats, which gave the gentleman the opportunity to spur his mare, and Sancho to urge on his donkey, and the driver to hurry his mules, all of them attempting to get as far away from the wagon as they could before the lions were freed. Sancho wept for the death of his master. This time he believed there was no doubt he would fall into the clutches of the lions. He cursed his luck, and called it an evil hour when it had occurred to him to serve his master again. But his weeping and lamentations did not prevent him from kicking the donkey to hurry him away from the wagon. Then the lion keeper, seeing that those who were fleeing had reached safety, pleaded with and warned Don Quixote, using the same pleas and warnings he had used before, and Don Quixote responded that he had heard what he had said, what he had to say, and he should not trouble himself with more warnings and pleas, for they would be to no avail, and what he should do was hurry. In the time it took the lion keeper to unlock the first cage, Don Quixote was considering if it would be better to do battle on foot or on horseback, and finally he decided to do battle on foot, fearing that Rocinante would become frightened at the sight of the lions. For this reason he leaped from his horse, tossed away his lance, looked up, took up his shield, unsheathed his sword, and at a deliberate pace, with marvelous courage and a valiant heart, he went to stand before the wagon, commending himself with all his heart first to God and then to his lady Dulcinea. And it is worth noting that when he reached this point, the author of this true history exclaimed, "O most valiant and supremely courageous Don Quixote of the Mancha, paragon of all the brave men in the world, a second and new Don Manuel de Leon, the glory and honor of Spanish knights. And there is a note after Don Manuel de Leon, and it says, as indicated in note 7, oh my gosh, it's like referring other notes in different chapters now. In different parts too, okay. As indicated in note 7, chapter 49 of part 1, Don Manuel de Leon. Leon is a province in Spain as well as the word that means lion. Retrieved a glove from the lion's cage at the request of a lady and then slapped her for needlessly endangering the life of a knight. Wild. Tech Papa, thank you so much for the follow. Good to see you. What words shall I use to recount the fearsome deed? What phrases will lend it credence in times to come? What phrases can I find that do not suit and befit you, even if they are the most hyperbolic of hyperboles? You on foot, you alone, you intrepid and of a noble mind, armed only with a sword, and not one of those with a dog on a blade, and with a shield not made of bright and shining steel. You stand waiting and anticipating the two most savage lions ever born in the African jungle. And there is a note after a dog on a blade, and it says, certain fine swords had the image of a dog engraved on a blade. Oh, enjoy your lurk. May your own deeds sing your praises, most valiant Manchegan. I shall leave them here in all your perfection, for I do not have the words with which to extol them. The aforementioned exclamation of the author ended here, and he moved on, picking up the thread of the history and saying that when the lion keeper saw that Don Quixote was in position, and that he himself could not avoid freeing the male lion without falling into disfavor with the wrathful and audacious knight, he opened wide the first cage, which held, as has been said, the male lion, who appeared to be of extraordinary size and fearsome and hideous aspect. The first thing the lion did was to turn around in the cage where he had been lying and unsheath his claws and stretch his entire body. Then he opened his mouth and yawned very slowly and extended a tongue almost 2 spans long, and cleaned the dust from his eyes and washed his face. When this was finished, he put his head out of the cage and looked all around with eyes like coals, a sight and a vision that could frighten temerity itself. Only Don Quixote looked at him attentively, wanting him to leap from the wagon and come within reach of his hands, for he intended to tear him to pieces. These are the extremes to which Don Quixote's unprecedented madness took him. But the magnanimous lion, more courteous than arrogant, took no notice of either childishness or bravado, and after looking in both directions, as has been said, he turned his back and showed his hindquarters to Don Quixote, and with great placidity and calm went back inside the cage. Seeing this, Don Quixote ordered the lion keeper to hit him and provoke him into coming out. I don't think that's a good idea. That I will not do, responded the lion keeper, because if I instigate him, the first one he'll tear to pieces will be me. Señor, your grace should be content with what you have done, which is all that anyone could ask in the matter of courage, and not tempt fortune a single time. The lion's door is open. It is up to him to come out or not, but if he hasn't come out by now, he won't come out for the rest of the day. The greatness of your grace's heart has been clearly demonstrated. No brave warrior, to my understanding, is obliged to do more than challenge his opponent and wait for him in the field. If his adversary does not appear, the dishonor lies with him, and the one left waiting wins the crown of victory. That is true, responded Don Quixote. And so, friend, Close the door, and give me the best statement you can regarding what you have seen me do, which is to say, you opened the lion's cage. I waited for him. He did not come out. Still, I waited for him. And still he did not come out, but lay down again. I need do no more. And so away with enchantments, and may God protect justice and truth and true chivalry. Close the door, as I have said, while I signal to those who have fled and run away, so that they may hear of this great deed from your own lips. The lion keeper did so, and Don Quixote, attaching to the end of his lance the cloth he had used to wipe away the downpour of curds on his face, began to call those who had not stopped fleeing or looking back at every step, all of them in a mad rush, with the gentleman at their head. But Sancho saw the signal and the white cloth, and he said, "Strike me dead if my master hasn't defeated the savage beasts, for he's calling us." Everyone stopped and realized that the one signaling was Don Quixote, and losing some part of their fear, they gradually approached until they could clearly hear Don Quixote calling to them. Finally, they returned to the wagon, and when they arrived, Don Quixote said to the driver, "Yoke your mules again, my friend, and continue on your way, and you, Sancho, give him 2 gold escudos, one for him and one for the lion keeper, in recompense for the delay I have caused them." "I'll do that gladly," responded Sancho. "But what happened to the lions? Are they dead or alive?" Then the lion keeper, in great detail and with many pauses, recounted the outcome of the contest, exaggerating to the best of his ability and skill the valor of Don Quixote, the sight of whom made a coward of the lion, who refused and did not dare to leave his cage, although he had kept the door open for some time, and only because he had told the knight that it was tempting God to provoke the lion and force him to come out, which is what he wanted him to do, and despite the knight's wishes and against his will, he had allowed the door to be closed again. "What do you think of that, Sancho?" said Don Quixote. "Are there any enchantments that can prevail against true courage? Enchanters may deprive me of good fortune, but of spirit and courage, never." Sancho gave the men the escudos. The driver yoked his team. The lion keeper kissed Don Quixote's hand for the favor received, and promised to recount that valiant feat to the king himself when he arrived in court. "If, by chance, his majesty asks who performed the deed, tell him it was the Knight of the Lions. From this day forth, I want the name I have had until now, the Knight of the Sorrowful Face, to be changed, altered, turned, and transformed into this, and in doing so, I follow the ancient usage of knights-errant who changed their names whenever they wished, or whenever it seemed appropriate." The wagon went on its way, and Don Quixote, Sancho, and the gentleman of the green coat continued on theirs. In all this time, Don Diego de Miranda had not said a word, but was careful to observe and note the actions and words of Don Quixote, who seemed to him a sane man gone mad, and a madman edging toward sanity. He had not yet heard anything about the first part of Don Quixote's history. If he had read it, he would no longer have been astonished by his actions and words, for he would have known the nature of his madness. But since he did not, he sometimes thought him sane, and sometimes mad, because his speech was coherent, elegant, and eloquent, and his actions nonsensical, reckless, and foolish. He said to himself, "What greater madness can there be than putting on a helmet full of curds, and believing that enchanters had softened one's head? And what greater temerity and foolishness than to attempt to do battle with lions?" Hey guys, I met some nutjob on the road, and he wanted to fight the lion. It just laid down bored, and he thought he was brave. He wanted me to tell you this. And also he wants to be called Knight of the Lions. Perfect reenactment of what happened. Don Quixote drew him away from these thoughts and his soliloquy by saying, "Who can doubt, Señor Don Diego de Miranda, that in the opinion of your grace I am foolish and witless man? And it would not be surprising if you did, because my actions do not attest to anything else. Even so, I would like your grace to observe that I am not as mad or as foolish as I must have seemed to you. A gallant knight is pleasing in the eyes of his king when, in the middle of a great plaza, he successfully thrusts his lance into a fierce bull. A knight is pleasing when, dressed in shining armor, he enters the field and contends in lively jousts before the ladies. And all those knights who engage in military exercises, or seem to, entertain and enliven and, if one may say so, honor the courts of their princes. But above and beyond all these, the best seems to be the knight-errant, who travels wastelands and desolate places, crossroads and forests and mountains, seeking dangerous adventures and attempting to bring them to a happy and fortunate conclusion, his sole purpose being to achieve glorious and lasting fame. The knight-errant who helps a widow in some deserted spot seems better, I say, than a courtier knight flattering a damsel in the city. All knights have their own endeavors. Let the courtier serve the ladies, and lend majesty to the courts of his king with livery. Let him sustain poor knights with the splendors of his table, arrange jousts, support tourneys, and show himself to be great, liberal, magnanimous, and, above all, a good Christian. And in this manner he will meet his precise obligations. But let the knight-errant search all the concerns of the world. Let him enter into the most intricate labyrinths, attempt the impossible at each step he takes, resist in empty wastelands the burning rays of the sun in summer, and in winter the harsh rigors of freezing winds. Let him not be dismayed by lions, or frightened by monsters, or terrified by dragons. Searching for these and lacking those and vanquishing them all are his principal and true endeavors. I, then, since it is my fortune to be counted in the number of knights-errant, cannot help but attack all things that seem to me to fall within the jurisdiction of my endeavors, and so it was my rightful place to attack the lions which I now attacked, although I knew it was exceedingly reckless, because I know very well what valor means. It is a virtue that occupies a place between two wicked extremes, which are cowardice and temerity. But it is better for the valiant man to touch on and climb to the heights of temerity than to touch on and fall to the depths of cowardice. And just as it is easier for the prodigal to be generous than the miser, it is easier for the reckless man to become truly brave than for the coward. And in the matter of undertaking adventures, your grace may believe me, Señor Don Diego. It is better to lose with too many cards than too few, because this knight is reckless and daring sounds better to the ear of those who hear it than this knight is timid and cowardly. Señor Don Quixote, responded Don Diego, I say that everything your grace has said and done has been balanced on the scale of reason itself, and I understand that if the code and laws of knight-errantry were ever lost, they would be found again in your grace's heart, as if they were in their own repository and archive. And now let us hurry, for it is getting late. When we reach my village and house, your grace can rest from your recent labors, if not of the body, then of the spirit, which can often lead to the body's fatigue. I consider your offer a great kindness and favor, Señor Don Diego, responded Don Quixote. And spurring their mounts more than they had up until then, at about 2 o'clock they reached the village and house of Don Diego, whom Don Quixote called the Knight of the Green Coat. End of chapter 17. Okay, Don Quixote is just so wild, and being Sancho and seeing everything is also so wild. And like knowing when specific things are outrageous and dangerous, crazy. I love that Sancho had a bunch of curds and didn't know what to do with them when Don Quixote called him, and he just put them in the helmet. And then Don Quixote put the helmet on, and it's just like dripping down his face. And of course, Don Quixote is convinced that an enchanter did this, and Sancho's just going along with it. He's like, yeah, totally. Like, the enchanter did this so that you would be mad at me. Just so that Don Quixote wouldn't be mad at him. Oh my gosh, so funny. And so wild that there's elephants coming in these cages, and Don Quixote is like, I need to fight them. I need to prove that I am brave and I must fight these lions. Open the cages. And everybody around him is like, maybe not, maybe not. And Don Quixote is like, yeah, we're gonna open those cages. Do it. Come on. Come on, let's do it. And it opens the cages, and the lion is just like, whatever, dude. I don't need to fight you. And Don Quixote's like, okay, let's rattle the lion. Start hitting him, because I must fight the lion. And the lion keeper's like, let's not, because you've already won, right? Like, you're victorious in this, so let's just go with that win. And Don Quixote accepts that, and he's like, all right, but when people come back, you need to tell them exactly how amazing I am and how the lion just didn't want to fight me. And also tell the king that. Thank you. So wild, so funny. It just, it's great. Thanks, Stevie. All right. Chapter 18. We are on page 567. Oh, I have an itch. Hold on. Real quick. There we go. Okay. Chapter 18. Regarding what befell Don Quixote in the castle, or house, of the Knight of the Green Coat, along with bizarre matters. I love the warning that Cervantes gives us. That's like, okay, first of all, you know he's going to think that the house is a castle, and also bizarre things are coming. Just letting you know. Don Quixote found Don Diego de Miranda's house to be spacious in the rustic manner. His coat of arms, though of rough stone, was above the street door, the storeroom in the courtyard, the wine cellar, the entrance hall, and on many large earthenware jars, which, because they were from Toboso, revived in Don Quixote memories of his enchanted and transformed Dulcinea. And heaving a sigh, and not caring what he said or whom he was with, he said, O sweet treasures, discovered to my sorrows, sweet and joyous when God did will them so. And there is a note after that two couplet that says, these are verses from one of Garcilaso's sonnets. Zorro himself making an appearance. The Don Diego. O Tobosan vessel, which have brought to mind the sweetest treasure of my deepest grief. He was heard to say this by the student poet, Don Diego's son, who had come out with his mother to receive him, and both mother and son marveled at the strange figure of Don Quixote, who, dismounting Rocinante, very courteously went up to her and asked to kiss her hands. And Don Diego said, Señora, Welcome with your customary amiability, Señor Don Quixote of La Mancha, whom you have here before you, the most valiant and intelligent knight-errant in the world. Bambi After Hours, thank you so much for the follow. Welcome in. The lady, whose name was Doña Cristina, received him with signs of great affection and courtesy, and Don Quixote responded with a number of judicious and courteous phrases. He used almost the same phrases with the student, who, when he heard Don Quixote speak, thought him a man of intelligence and wit. Here the author depicts all the details of Don Diego's house, portraying for us what the house of a wealthy gentleman farmer contains. But the translator of this history decided to pass over these and other similar minutiae in silence, because they did not accord for the principal purpose of the history, whose strength lies more in its truth than in cold digressions. I love this, breaking the fourth wall type deal, because we are reading the history as written by a historian who is watching all of Don Quixote's adventures, but being translated by a translator. There's so many layers, and it's great. They led Don Quixote to a chamber, where Sancho removed his armor, leaving him in pantaloons and a chamois doublet that was stained with the grime of his armor. His collar was wide and soft like a student's, without starch or lace trimming. His tights were date-colored, and his shoes waxed. He girded on his trusty sword, which hung from a sword-belt made of seal-skin, for it is believed that for many years he suffered from a kidney ailment. Over this he wore a short cape of good dark cloth, but first of all, with 5 pots, or perhaps 6 pots of water, there being some difference of opinion regarding the number, he washed his head and face, and still the water was the color of whey, thanks to Sancho's gluttony and his purchase of the black-hearted curds that turned his master so white. With these adornments and genteel grace and gallantry, Don Quixote went to another room, where the student was waiting to entertain him while the tables were being laid, for with the arrival of so noble a guest, Señora Doña Cristina wished to show that she knew how and was able to lavish attention on those who visited her house. While Don Quixote was removing his armor, Don Lorenzo, which was the name of Don Diego's son, had the opportunity to say to his father, "Señor, who can this knight be whom you have brought to our house? His name and appearance, and his saying that he is a knight-errant, have baffled my mother and me." "Son, I do not know what to tell you," responded Don Diego. "I can say only that I have seen him do things worthy of the greatest madman in the world, and heard him say things so intelligent that they wipe out and undo his mad acts. Speak to him, and explore what he knows, and since you are clever, you'll make a reasonable judgment regarding his cleverness or foolishness, though to tell you the truth, I think he's more mad than sane." Then Don Lorenzo went in to entertain Don Quixote, as has been said, and among other exchanges that passed between them, Don Quixote said to Don Lorenzo, "Your Grace's father, Señor Don Diego de Miranda, has informed me of the rare ability and subtle ingenuity which your Grace possesses, and, in particular, that your Grace is a great poet." "A poet, perhaps," responded Don Lorenzo, "but by no means great. The truth is, I have a predilection for poetry and for reading good poets, but that does not justify calling me great, as my father has done." "This humility does not seem a bad thing to me," responded Don Quixote, "because there is no poet who is not arrogant, and does not think himself the greatest poet in the world." "Every rule has its exception," responded Don Lorenzo, "and there must be some who are great, and do not think so." "A few," responded Don Quixote. But tell me, your grace, what verses are you at work on now? Your father has told me that they have made you somewhat restive and thoughtful. If it is a gloss, I know something about the subject and would like very much to hear it. If the verses are for a literary competition, your grace should try to win second place. First is always won through favor, or because of the high estate of the person. Second is won because of pure justice, and by this calculation, third becomes second, and first becomes third, in the manner of the degrees offered by universities. But, even so, being called first carries with it great celebrity. So far, said Don Lorenzo to himself, I can't call you crazy. Let's move on. And to Don Quixote, he said, It seems to me that your grace has spent time in school. What sciences have you studied? The science of knight-errantry, responded Don Quixote, which is as good as poetry, and perhaps even a little better. I don't know that science, replied Don Lorenzo. I haven't heard of it until now. It is a science, replied Don Quixote, that contains all or most of the sciences in the world, because the man who professes it must be a jurist, and know the laws of distributive and commutative justice, so that he may give to each person what is his, and what he ought to have. He must be a theologian, so that he may know how to explain the Christian law he professes clearly and distinctly, no matter where he is asked to do so. He must be a physician, and principally an herbalist, so that he may know, in the midst of wastelands and deserts, the herbs that have the virtue to heal wounds, for the knight-errant cannot always go looking for someone to heal him. He must be an astrologer, so that he can tell by the stars how many hours of the night have passed, and in what part of climate of the world he finds himself. He must know mathematics, because at every step he will have need of them, and leaving aside the fact that he must be adorned with all the theological and cardinal virtues, and descending to the small details, I say that he must know how to swim as well as, say, the fisherman Nicolas or Nicoleo. Excuse me. That is a name. I am terrible with saying names. Could swim. He must know how to shoe a horse and repair a saddle and bridle, and returning to what was said before, he must keep his faith in God and in his lady. He must be chaste in his thoughts, honest in his words, liberal in his actions, valiant in his deeds, long-suffering in his afflictions, charitable with those in need, and, finally, an upholder of the truth, even if it costs him his life to defend it. And there is a note after Nicolas or Nicoleo, and it says, a creature who, like an amphibian, spent as much time in the water as on land. As early as the 12th century, he was alluded to in troubadour poetry and identified with Saint Nicholas of Bari. Of all these great and trivial parts, a good knight-errant is composed, and so your grace may judge, Signor Don Lorenzo, if the science learned by the knight who studies and professes it is a shallow one, and if it can be compared to the noblest that are taught in colleges and schools. Orestes Media, thank you so much for the follow. Welcome in. If this is true, replied Don Lorenzo, I say this science surpasses all of them. What do you mean, if this is true? Responded Don Quixote. What I mean to say, said Don Lorenzo, is that I doubt there have ever been knights-errant, or that there are any now, who are adorned with so many virtues. Oh, sorry, Star. You need to pick a new major. No longer can you major in knight-errant. I have often said what I repeat now, responded Don Quixote. Most of the people in the world are of the opinion that there never have been knights-errant, And it seems to me that if heaven does not miraculously reveal to them the truth that they did exist and do exist now, any effort I make must be in vain, as experience has so often shown me, and so I do not wish to take the time now to free your grace from the error you share with many others. What I intend to do is pray that heaven frees you from it, and allows you to understand how beneficial and necessary knights-errant were to the world in the past, and how advantageous they could be in the present, if they were still in use. But what triumphs now, because of people's sins, are sloth, idleness, gluttony, and self-indulgence. Our guest has gotten away from us, said Don Lorenzo to himself. But even so, he is a gallant madman, and I would be a weak-minded fool if I didn't think so. Here their conversation came to an end, because they were called to the table. Don Diego asked his son what he had deduced regarding their guest's wits, to which he responded, "Not all the physicians and notaries in the world could make a final accounting of his madness. He is a combination madman who has many lucid intervals." They went in to eat, and the meal was just the kind that Don Diego had declared on the road that he usually provided for his guests, pure, abundant, and delicious. But what pleased Don Quixote the most was the marvelous silence that reigned throughout the house, which seemed like a Carthusian monastery. And so when the tablecloths had been removed, and thanks given to God, and water poured over hands, Don Quixote most earnestly asked Don Lorenzo to recite his verses for the literary competition, to which he responded that, in order not to seem like one of those poets who refuse when they are asked to recite their verses and spew them forth when they aren't asked, "I'll recite my gloss, for which I don't expect any prize at all. I've written it only to exercise my wits." "A wise friend of mine," responded Don Quixote, "was of the opinion that nobody ought to tire of glossing verses, and the reason, he said, was that the gloss never could approach the text, and that many or most times the gloss strayed from the intention and purpose of what the text proposed. Moreover, the laws of the gloss were too strict, for they did not allow questions, or he said, or I shall say, or the making of verbs into nouns, or changing the significance, along with other restrictions and regulations that set limits for those who write glosses, as your grace must know." "Truly, Señor Don Quixote," said Don Lorenzo, "I would like to catch your grace in some foolish mistake, and I can't, because you slip out of my hands like an eel." "I do not understand," responded Don Quixote, "what your grace says or means to say about my slipping away." "I'll explain later," responded Don Quixote. Or Don Lorenzo. There's too many Dons going on right now. "I'll explain later," responded Don Lorenzo. "But for now, your grace should listen to the glossed verses and to the gloss, which read like this: If my was would be an is, not waiting for a will be, or if at last the time would come, when later is now and here." Gloss. "At last, since all things pass, the good that fortune gave me passed too, though once o'erflowing, and never to me return, neither scant nor in abundance. Not for centuries or fortune have you seen me at your feet. Make me contented once more. My great good fortune will be, if my was would be an is. I wish no joy or glory, neither honor nor victory, no other triumph or conquest, but to return to the joy that's nothing but grief in memory. If you can return me there, O fortune, this fiery torment will ease. Do it now, I pray, not waiting for a will be. What I ask is the impossible, For there is no force on earth that has the power to turn back time that has passed us by, to bring back what once was ours. Time traces, it flies, it changes past, and will never return. And only once a fool would beg a halt, or if the time would pass, or if at last the time would come. I live a life of perplexity, torn between hoping and fear. This is a death in life for me. Much better to end my sorrow and die the death of the tomb. And though my wish is to end my life, my reason tells me no, and hands me back my gloomy life in terror of that after time, when later is now and here. Don Duck, Don Corleone, Don Quixote, Don Diego de la Vega. Too many. When Don Lorenzo finished reciting his gloss, Don Quixote rose to his feet, and in a loud voice that was almost a shout, and grasping Don Lorenzo's right hand in his own, he said, "Praise be to heaven on high, magnanimous youth, for you are the best poet on earth, and you deserve to be crowned with a laurel wreath, not by Cyprus or Gaeta, as a poet once said, may God forgive him, but by the academies of Athens, if they still existed today, and by those that do in Paris, Bologna, and Salamanca." And there is a note after, as a Cyprus or Gaeta, as a poet once said, and it says, probably Pedro Liñanan de Riaza, 1558, there's a question mark, to 1607, a poet praised by Cervantes. May it please heaven that the judges who would deprive you of first place be pierced by the arrows of Phoebus, and may the muses never cross the thresholds of their houses. If you please, Señor, tell me some verses in a long line, for I wish to explore your admirable talent thoroughly. And there is a note after verses in a long line, and it says, the meter of Spanish poetry is essentially determined by the number of syllables in a line. The short line, arte menor, has 8 syllables or less. The long line, arte mayor, has 9 or more syllables. Here, the long line is the hen. I have never seen this word before. Hold on a second while I hooked on phonics it. Hendecasyllable? Hendecasyllable? The 11 syllable line, perfected by Petrarch, which influenced all of European poetry in the Renaissance, and is generally associated with the sonnet. Garcilaso de la Vega naturalized this meter in Spanish early in the 16th century. It is surprising to anyone that Don Lorenzo was extremely happy to be praised by Don Quixote, even though he considered him mad. Oh, flattery, how powerful you are, how far you extend, how widespread the boundaries of your pleasant domain. Don Lorenzo gave credence to this truth by acceding to the request and desire of Don Quixote and reciting this sonnet on the tale or history of Pyramus and Thisbe. Sonnet. The wall is breached by the beauteous maid who pierced the gallant bosom of Pyramus. Love flies from Cyprus faster than an arrow to see the rift so prodigious and so narrow. Silence speaks there, no human voice will dare to pass through a cleft so strait and constrained, but enamored souls will, for love's sweet speed can ease the rigors of that perilous deed. Desire broke its tether, and the reckless steps of the emboldened damsel seemed to demand death as the sole response to longed-for pleasure. Oh, a rare tale and strange, both at one moment are killed and interred and recalled forever. One sword, one grave, one memory for two. Praise be to God, said Don Quixote, when he had heard Don Lorenzo's sonnet. Among the infinite number of consumptive poets, señor, I have seen a consummate poet, which is what your grace is, and what the artfulness of this sonnet leads me to believe. For 4 days, Don Quixote was wonderfully regaled in the house of Don Diego, and at the end of this time he asked permission to leave, telling his host that he was grateful of the kind of generous treatment he had received in his house, but because it did not seem right for knights-errant to devote too many hours to idleness and leisure, he wished to fulfill his obligations and go in search of adventures, for he had heard that this land abounded in them, and this was where he hoped to pass the time until the day of the jousts in Zaragoza, when he would vanquish all adversaries. But first he had to enter the cave of Montesinos, about which so many marvelous things were recounted in that district, and he would also look into and inquire about the origin and true source of the 7 lakes of Ruidera, as they were commonly called. Hello, Red Talus, good to see you. Don Diego and his son praised his honorable determination, and told him to take from their house and estate everything he wished, for they would serve him most willingly, as they were bound to do because of the worth of his person and the honorable profession he pursued. At last the day of his departure arrived, as joyful for Don Quixote as it was sad, and mournful for Sancho Panza, who was quite content with the abundance in Don Diego's house, and opposed this return to the hunger that was customary in forests and wastelands, and in the meagreness of his badly provisioned saddlebags. Despite this, he filled them to the top with what he thought most necessary, and as they took their leave, Don Quixote said to Don Lorenzo, I do not know if you have already told your grace, and if I have, I shall tell you again, that when your grace wishes to save a good deal of time and trouble in your ascent to the inaccessible summit of the Temple of Fame, you need do nothing else but leave the narrow path of poetry and follow the even narrower one of knight-errantry, which will suffice to make you an emperor in the blink of an eye. With these words, Don Quixote brought to a close the question of his madness, in particular when he added these, saying, God knows I should like to take Señor Don Lorenzo with me, to teach him how one must pardon the meek, and subdue and trample the proud, virtues deeply connected to the profession I follow. But since his youth does not ask it, nor his meritorious pursuits consent it, I shall be content with merely advising your grace that, being a poet, you can achieve fame if you are guided more by other people's opinions than by your own, for no father or mother thinks their children are ugly, and for those born of the understanding, such deception is in even greater danger. Once again, the father and son were astonished by the mixed speech of Don Quixote, sometimes intelligent, and sometimes utterly foolish, and by the persistence and perseverance of his complete devotion to the search for his misadventurous adventures, which were the subject and goal of all his desires. The compliments and courtesies were repeated, and with the kind permission of the lady of the castle, Don Quixote and Sancho, mounted on Rocinante and the donkey, took their leave. End of chapter 18. So silly. Alright, so Don Quixote and Sancho Panza go to the house of Don Diego and meet the wife, Dona Cristina, and the son, Don Lorenzo, who is a poet. And Don Quixote is like, you must tell me your poetry. Recite it for me. And Don Lorenzo is like, well, all right. And he does. And Don Quixote is just blown away. Just loves it so, so much. So much, in fact, that he stays for 4 days in their house before deciding to continue on to Zaragoza, which is wild. Which I think it's funny that they mention that Sancho is not looking forward to traveling because he's gotten so used to being in the house for these past 4 days and having enough food to where he's not tired and not hungry all the time. But there are, as Don Lorenzo and Don Diego have pointed out, there are times when Don Quixote is just so intelligent and so smart. And then other times where it's just like, what? What did you say? Like the whole idea of saying, like, if you are submitting your poetry, aim for second place. First is reserved for people who have the high connections. Second place is hard to get, and it's really first place. Like that's just so interesting. Okay. First place is bought and paid for. Second place has to be earned. Yes. Welcome back. All right. Chapter 19, which recounts the adventure of the enamored shepherd and other truly pleasing matters. Don Quixote had not gone very far from Don Diego's house when he encountered two men who seemed to be clerics or students, and two peasants, each riding a donkey-ish mount. And there is a note after clerics or students, and it says, university students and clerics wore the same kind of clothing. One of the students carried as a kind of portmanteau, a piece of green buckram, and wrapped in it there were, apparently, a piece of fine scarlet cloth and two pairs of ribbed serge hose. The other carried only two new black fencing foils with leather tips on the points. The peasants carried other things, which were a sign and indication that they were returning from some large city where they had bought them and were carrying them back to their village. Both students and peasants experienced the same astonishment felt by all who saw Don Quixote for the first time, and they longed to know who this man might be who was so different from other men. Don Quixote greeted them, and after he learned the road they were taking, which was the same one he was following, he offered them his company and asked them to slow their pace because their donkeys walked faster than his horse, and to oblige them, in a few brief words, he told them who he was, and his calling and profession, which was to be a knight-errant who was seeking adventures everywhere in the world. He told them that his proper name was Don Quixote of La Mancha, and that his title was the Knight of the Lions. For the peasants, all of this was like speaking to them in Greek or in gibberish, but not for the students, who soon understood the weakness in Don Quixote's mind. Even so, they viewed him with admiration and respect, and one of them said, Señor Knight, if your grace is not following a specific route, as those searching for adventures usually do not, your grace should come with us, and you will see on the finest and richest weddings ever celebrated in La Mancha, or for many leagues around. Sunny Day Enjoyer, thank you so much for the follow. Also, thanks for the chat. Welcome in. Good to see you. Don Quixote asked him if it was a prince's wedding that he was praising so highly. No, responded the student, not a prince, but the richest farmer in this entire land, and the most beautiful farm girl men have ever seen. The preparations for the wedding celebration are extraordinary and remarkable, because it will be held in a meadow near the bride's village. She is always called the fair Quiteria, and the groom is called the rich Camacho. She is 18 and he is 22. They are equals, though certain inquisitive people who have the lineage of the entire world memorized claim that fair Quiteria's is superior to Camacho's. But nobody thinks about that nowadays. Wealth has the power to mend a good many cracks. In fact, Camacho is extremely generous, and he has taken a notion to weave branches into a bower to cover the entire meadow, so that the sun will have great difficulty if it wants to come in to visit the green grass covering the ground. He also has arranged for dances, with swords and with bells, for there are in his village people who are excellent at ringing and shaking them, and I won't say anything about the heel tappers, for the general opinion is that he has a good number of them ready, but none of the things I've mentioned, or the many others that I've omitted, are what will make this wedding memorable, but rather the things I imagine a desperate Basilio will do. This Basilio is a shepherd from the same village as Quiteria, and his house shared a wall with the house of Quiteria's parents, allowing love the opportunity to renew in the world the long-forgotten loves of Pyramus and Thisbe. Because Basilio loved Quiteria from his earliest, tenderest youth, and she responded to his desire with 1,000 honest favors, so that in the village the love of the two children, Basilio and Quiteria, were recounted with amusement. As they grew older, Quiteria's father decided to deny Basilio the access to his house that he once had enjoyed, and to spare himself mistrust and endless suspicion, he arranged for his daughter to marry rich Camacho, for it did not seem a good idea to marry her to Basilio, who was better endowed by nature than by fortune. If the truth be told, without envy, he is the most agile youth we know, a great hurler of the bar, an excellent wrestler, a fine pelota player. He runs like a deer, leaps like a goat, and plays bowls as if he were enchanted. He sings like a lark, plays the guitar so well he makes it speak, and, most of all, he can fence with the best of them. You love this book. Oh, so good. Oh my gosh, and you've read it in the 16th century Spanish? Wild, wild. This is my first read through, and I'm really enjoying it so far. For that one accomplishment, said Don Quixote, the youth deserved not only to marry fair Quiteria, but Queen Genevieve, herself, if she were alive today, in spite of Lancelot and all the others who might wish to prevent it. Try telling that to my wife, said Sancho Panza, who, so far, had been listening in silence. The only thing she wants is for everybody to marry their equal, following the proverb that says, like goes to like. What I'd like is for this good Basilio, and I'm growing very fond of him, to marry Senora Quiteria. People who keep people who love each other from marrying should rest in peace, world without end. And I was going to say the opposite. If all people who love each other were to marry, said Don Quixote, it would deprive parents of the right and privilege to marry their children to the person and at the time they ought to marry. If daughters were entitled to choose their own husbands, one would choose her father's servants, and another a man she saw walking on the street, who seemed to her proud and gallant, although he might be a debauchee and a braggart, for love and affection easily blind the eye of the understanding, which are so necessary for choosing one's estate, and the estate of matrimony is a particular risk of error, and great caution is required, and the particular favor of heaven, in order to choose correctly. If a person wishes to make a long journey, and if he is prudent, before setting out he will find reliable and peaceful companionship for his travels. Then why would he not do the same for the journey that takes a lifetime, until it reaches the resting place of death, and especially if his companion will be with him in bed, at the table, everywhere, which is how a wife accompanies her husband. The companionship of one's own wife is not merchandise that, once purchased, can be returned or exchanged or altered. It is an irrevocable circumstance that lasts as long as one lives. It is a rope that, if put around one's neck, turns into the Gordian knot, and if the scythe of death does not cut it, there is no way to untie it. I could say much more with regard to the subject, but I am kept from doing so by my desire to know if the distinguished licentiate has more to tell us of the history of Basilio. To which the student bachelor, or licentiate, as Don Quixote called him, responded, "There really is no more for me to say except that, ever since the moment Basilio learned that fair Quiteria was marrying rich Camacho, he has not been known to laugh, or to speak coherently, and he always goes about pensive and sad, talking to himself, which are clear and certain signs that he has lost his mind. He eats little, and sleeps little, and what he does eat is fruit, and if he does sleep it is in the fields, on the hard ground, like a dumb animal. From time to time he looks up at the sky. At other times he fixes his eyes on the ground, and is so entranced that he seems to be a dressed statue whose clothes are moved by the breeze. In short, he gives so many indications of having a heart maddened by love that those of us who know him fear that when a fair Quiteria takes her marriage vows tomorrow, it will be his death sentence." "God will find the cure," said Sancho, "for God gives the malady and also the remedy. Nobody knows the future. There's a lot of hours until tomorrow, and in one of them, and even in a moment, the house can fall. I've seen it rain at the same time the sun is shining. A man goes to bed healthy and can't move the next day. And tell me, is there anybody who can boast that he's driven a nail into Fortune's wheel? No, of course not, and I wouldn't dare put the point of a pin between a woman's yes and no, because it wouldn't fit. Tell me that Quiteria loves Basilio with all her heart and all her soul, and I'll give him a sack of good fortune, because I've heard that love looks through spectacles that make copper look like gold, poverty like riches, and dried rheum like pearls." "Damn you, Sancho, where will you stop?" said Don Quixote. "When you begin to string together proverbs and stories, nobody can endure it but Judas himself, and may Judas himself take you. Tell me, you brute, what did you know of nails or wheels or anything else?" "Oh, well, if none of you understand me," responded Sancho, "it's no wonder my sayings are taken for nonsense. But it doesn't matter. I understand what I'm saying, and I know there's not much foolishness in what I said, but your grace is always sentencing what I say and even what I do." "Censoring is what you should say," said Don Quixote, "and not sentencing, you corrupter of good language. May God confound you." "Your grace shouldn't get so angry with me," responded Sancho, "because you know I didn't grow up at court or study at Salamanca, so how would I know if I'm adding or taking away letters from my words? God save me, you can't force a Sayagan to talk like a Toledan, and there may be Toledans who don't talk better than anybody else." There's a note after Toledan, and it says, "People from Sayagal, in modern province of Zamora, spoke with a rustic accent that was often used in the theater for comic effect. Natives of Toledo were thought to speak in extremely correct and pure Spanish." Oh, I'm so glad. If I can turn the page, there we go. "That's true," said the licentiate, "because those who grew up in Tenerías and in Zocodover cannot speak as well as those who spend almost the entire day strolling in the cloister of the cathedrals, and all of them are Toledans. Pure language, appropriate, elegant, and clear, is used by discerning courtiers, even if they are born in Mahalahonda, maybe. And there's a note after that, and it says, a village near Madrid. I said discerning because there are many who are not, and discernment is the grammar of good language, which is acquired with use. I, senores, for my sins, have studied canon law at Salamanca, and am rather proud of speaking with words that are clear, plain, and meaningful. If you hadn't been prouder of how you move those foils you're carrying than of how you wag your tongue, said the other student, whose name was Corchuelo, maybe you would have placed first for your licentiate instead of last. Look, bachelor, responded the licentiate, you hold the most erroneous opinion in the world about skill with the sword, since you consider it useless. As far as I'm concerned, it's not an opinion, but an established truth, replied Corchuelo. And if you would like me to prove it to you experientially, you're carrying the foils. There's a convenient spot. I have a steady hand and strength, and together with my courage, which is no small thing, they will make you confess that I am not mistaken. Dismount and use your changes of posture, your circles, your angles, and your science. I expect to make you see stars at midday with my crude modern skills, and after God I put my trust in them, and there's no man born who will make me turn away, and none in the world whom I can force to retreat. And there is a note right where we ended, and it says, the dispute between the bachelor and the licentiate is based on the latter's adherence to the elaborately theoretical handbooks on the art and science of fencing that were extremely popular in the 16th and 17th centuries. I won't get involved in questions of turning or not turning away, replied the master swordsman, though it might be that on the spot where you the first set your foot, your grave will open wide. I mean, that you'll be lying dead there on account of the master you despise so much. Now we'll see, responded Corchuelo. And he dismounted his donkey with great agility and furiously seized one of the foils that the licentiate was carrying on his animal. It should not be this way, said Don Quixote at that moment, for I wish to be the master of this duel and the judge of this question, so frequently left unresolved. And after dismounting Rocinante and grasping his lance, he stood in the middle of the road, at the same time that the licentiate, with spirited grace and measured steps, was advancing on Corchuelo, who came toward him, his eyes, as the saying goes, blazing. The two peasants who had accompanied them did not dismount their donkeys, but served as spectators to the mortal tragedy. The innumerable lunges, slashes, downward thrusts, reverse strokes, and two-handed blows executed by Corchuelo were denser than liver and more minute than hail. He attacked like an angry lion, but was met with a blow to the mouth by the tip of the licentiate's foil, which stopped him in the middle of his fury, and which he had to kiss as if it were a relic, though not as devotedly as relics should be kissed, and usually are. Finally, the licentiate's lunges accounted for all the buttons on the short cassock the bachelor was wearing, and slashed its skirts into the arms of an octopus. Twice he knocked off his hat, and tired him so much that in fury, anger, and rage the bachelor seized his foil by the hilt and threw it into the air with so much force that one of the peasants, who was a notary, went to retrieve it, and subsequently testified that it had flown almost 3/4 of a league, and this testimony serves, and has served, to demonstrate and prove the truth that force is vanquished by air. Corchuelo sat down, exhausted, and Sancho approached him and said, by my faith, Señor Bachelor, If your grace will take my advice, from now on you won't challenge anybody to a duel, but to wrestling or hurling the bar, since you are young enough and strong enough for that, because I've heard that the ones they call master swordsmen can put the tip of their sword through the eye of a needle. I'm happy, responded Corchuelo, that I fell off the high horse, and that experience has shown me a truth I refused to acknowledge. And, standing up, he embraced the licentiate, and they were better friends than before, and not wanting to wait for the notary who had gone after the foil because it seemed it would take too long, they resolved to continue on their way in order to reach Quixote's village early, for it is where all of them were from. For the rest of their journey, the licentiate told them about the excellencies of the sword, with so many demonstrations and figures and mathematical proofs that all of them were well informed regarding the virtues of the science, and Corchuelo's obstinacy was overcome. It was dusk, but before they arrived it seemed to everyone that the village sky was filled with innumerable brilliant stars. They also heard the sweet, confused sounds of various instruments, such as flutes, tambours, psalteries, flageolets. I am unfamiliar with that. Tambourines and timbrels, and when they came close they saw that a bower of trees, erected at the entrance of the village, was filled with lights, which were not disturbed by the wind that was blowing so gently it did not have the strength to move the leaves on the trees. The musicians were the entertainers of the wedding, and in various bands they wandered around that pleasant spot, some of them dancing, others singing, and still others playing the variety of aforementioned instruments. In fact, it seemed that in the meadow joy was dancing, and happiness leaping. Many other people were busy raising platforms where, on the following day, plays and dances could be comfortably viewed when they were performed in that place dedicated to solemnizing the marriage of rich Camacho and the funeral rites of Basilio. Don Quixote did not want to enter the village, though both the peasant and the bachelor asked him to, but he gave as an excuse, which seemed more than sufficient to him, that it was the custom of the knights-errant to sleep in fields and forests rather than in towns, even under gilded ceilings, and saying this, he went a little way off the road, much against the will of Sancho, who remembered the fine accommodations he had enjoyed in the castle or house of Don Diego. End of chapter 19. All right, so we meet more travelers, and they are headed back to their village and getting ready for a marriage between two people. And it seems like every time there's like a wedding, which has been many in this book, there's always drama. Always drama. So, this farm boy and farm girl are getting married. Camacho and Quiteria. And Quiteria. Something like that. And Basilio is super, super in love with Quiteria. And yeah. Quiteria's father has promised her to Camacho, so because he's richer, blah, blah, blah. Not as cute as Basilio, but fortune favors. Fortune favors the wealth, I guess, in this situation. And so they're traveling along, and it's so funny that the travelers are like, yeah, you should come inside and like stay with our village. And Don Quixote's like, no, knights errant sleep on the ground. and Sancho, I'm just imagining him like seeing the warm bed, imagining the warm bed that he would be sleeping in just disappear as he has to sleep on the ground again. So silly. So silly. Okay. Let me adjust real quick. Crisscross applesauce, here we go. Okay. Chapter 20, which recounts the wedding of rich Camacho, as well as what befell poor Basilio. No sooner had fair-complexioned Dawn allowed bright Phoebus with the ardor of his burning rays to dry the liquid pearls of her golden tresses, than Don Quixote, shaking idleness from his limbs, rose to his feet and called to his squire Sancho, who was still snoring. And Don Quixote saw this, and before he woke him, he said, "O thou, more fortunate than all those who live on the face of the earth, for thou dost not envy, nor art thou envied, and thou sleepest with a tranquil spirit, and thou art not pursued by enchanters, nor art thou alarmed by enchantments. Thou sleepest, I say it again, and shall say it 100 times more, without jealousy of thy lady keeping thee continually awake, nor thoughts of how to pay the debts thou owest, nor what thou must do to feed thyself and thy small, anguished family for another day. Ambition doth not disturb thee, nor doth the vain pomp of the world trouble thee, for the limits of thy desire extendeth not beyond caring for thy donkey. Thou hast placed care for thine own person on my shoulders, a weight and a burden that nature and custom hath given to thy masters. The servant sleepeth, and the master standeth watch, thinking of how he may sustain him, and improve him, and grant him favors. The anguish of seeing the sky turning to bronze and not giving succor to the earth with needed dew doth not afflict the servant, but the master, who must sustain in barrenness and hunger the one who served in fertility and plenty. Sancho did not respond to any of this, because he was asleep, and he would not have awakened very quickly if Don Quixote, with the blunt end of the lance, had not brought him back to consciousness. He awoke, finally, sleepy and lazy, and turning his head in every direction, he said, "Coming from the direction of that bower, if I'm not mistaken, there is an aroma that smells much more like a roasted side of bacon than reeds and thyme. By my faith, weddings that begin with smells like this must be plentiful and generous." "Enough, you glutton," said Don Quixote. "Come, we shall go to this ceremony to see what the scorned Basilio will do." "No matter what he does, what he'd like," responded Sancho, "is not to be poor and marry Quiteria. He doesn't have a quarto, and he wants to rise above the clouds. By my faith, señor, I think a poor man should be content with whatever he finds, and not go asking for the moon. I bet an arm that Camacho can bury Basilio in reales, and if that's true, as it must be, Quiteria would be a fool to give up the fine gifts and jewels that Camacho must have given her already, and still can give her, for the way Basilio hurls the bar and fences. A good throw and some nice swordplay won't get you half a liter of wine at the tavern. Talents and skills can't be sold are fine for Count Dirlos, but when those talents fall to somebody who has good money, then that's the life I'd like to have." And there is a note after Count Dirlos, and it says, "A figure who appears in traditional ballads." With a good foundation, you can build a good building, and the best foundation and groundwork in the world is money. "For the love of God, Sancho," said Don Quixote, "that's enough of your harangue. I really believe that if you were allowed to go on with the ones you are constantly beginning, you would not have time to eat or sleep. You would spend all of it talking." Don Quixote is totally not one to say that. "If your grace had a good memory," replied Sancho, "you'd remember the provisions of our agreement before we left home this time. One of them was that you'd have to let me talk all I wanted as long as I didn't say anything against my neighbor or your grace's authority. And so far, it seems to me I haven't disobeyed that provision." I do not remember, Sancho, responded Don Quixote, any such provision. And since that is so, I want you to be quiet and come along now. The instruments we heard last night again gladden the valleys, and no doubt the wedding will be celebrated in the coolness of the morning, not in the heat of the afternoon. Sancho did as his master commanded, and placed the saddle on Rocinante and the pack saddle on the donkey. The two men mounted, and at an unhurried pace they rode under the bower. The first thing that appeared before Sancho's eyes was an entire steer on a roasting spit made of an entire elm, and in the fire where it was to roast, a fair-sized mountain of wood was burning, and 6 pots that were placed around the fire were not made in the common mold of other pots, because these were 6 huge cauldrons, each one large enough to hold the contents of an entire slaughterhouse. They contained and enclosed entire sheep, which sank out of view as if they were doves, the hares without their skins, and the chickens without their feathers that were hanging from the trees, waiting to be buried in the cauldrons, were without number. The various kinds of fowl and game hanging from the trees to cool in the breeze were infinite. Sancho counted more than 60 wineskins, each one holding more than 2 arrobas, and all of them filled, as was subsequently proven, with excellent wines. There were also mounds of snowy white loaves of bread heaped up like piles of wheat on the threshing floor. Cheeses, crisscrossed like bricks, formed a wall, and 2 kettles of oil larger than a dryer's vat were used to fry rounds of dough, which were then removed with 2 strong paddles and plunged into another kettle filled with honey that stood nearby. And there is a note after arrobas, and it says, as indicated earlier, an arroba is a dry weight of 25 pounds and a variable liquid measure of 2.6 to 3.6 gallons. The cooks, male and female, numbered more than 50, all of them devoted, diligent, and contented. 12 small, tender suckling pigs were sewn into the extended belly of the steer to give it flavor and make it tender. The various spices seemed to have been brought not by the pound but by the arroba, and all of them were clearly visible in a large chest. In short, the provisions for the wedding were rustic, but so abundant they could have fed an army. Sancho Panza observed everything, and contemplated everything, and felt affection for everything. First, his desire was captivated and conquered by the cauldrons, from which he gladly would have filled a medium-sized pot. Then his affections were won over by the wineskins. Finally, the fruits of the skillet, if one could call the big-bellied kettles skillets. And so, when he could bear it no longer, and it was not in his power to do anything else, he approached one of the diligent cooks, and in courteous and hungry terms asked to be allowed to dip a crust of bread into one of those cauldrons. To which the cook responded, "Brother, thanks to rich Camacho, hunger has no jurisdiction today. Dismount and see if you can find a ladle, and skim off a chicken or 2, and hearty appetite to you." "I don't see one," responded Sancho. "Wait," the cook said. "Lord save me, but what a squeamish, fussy fellow you must be." And having said this, he seized a pot and dipped it into one of the cauldrons, then took out 3 chickens and 2 geese, and said to Sancho, "Eat, my friend, and break your fast with these skimmings until it's time to eat." "Oh, I don't have anything to put them in," responded Sancho. "Then take everything, the pot and all," said the cook, "for the riches and the happiness of Camacho will overlook that." While Sancho was engaged in these matters, Don Quixote watched as some 12 farmers, dressed in their best holiday clothes, and mounted on 12 beautiful mares, decked out in rich and colorful rustic trappings, with a good number of bells on the breast straps of their harnesses, rode under the bower. In an orderly troop they galloped not once, but many times around the meadow, joyfully crying and shouting, "Long live Camacho and Quiteria! He's as rich as she's fair, and she's the fairest in the world." Hearing which, Don Quixote said to himself, "It certainly seems that they have not seen my Dulcinea of Toboso, for if they had, they would restrain their praises." A short while later, many different groups of dancers began to come under the bower, among them one performing a sword dance, with 24 young men of gallant and spirited appearance, all dressed in thin white linen and wearing headscarves of fine multicolored silk. One of the men mounted on mares asked their leader, an agile youth, if any of the dancers had been hurt. "So far, thank God, nobody's been hurt. We're all fine." And then he began to wind his way among his companions, twisting and turning with so much skill that although Don Quixote had seen many such dances, he had never seen one as good as this. He also liked another group that came in, composed of beautiful young maidens, none younger than 14, none older than 18, all dressed in fine green cloth, their hair partly braided and partly hanging loose, and so blonde it could compete with the rays of the sun, and in their hair they wore garland made of jasmine, roses, amaranth, and honeysuckle. They were led by a venerable old man and an ancient matron, more agile and nimble than their years would lead one to expect. Their music was played by a Zamorin bagpipe, and the maidens, with modesty in their eyes and on their faces, and with agility in their feet, showed themselves to be the best dancers in the world. Behind them came another troupe in an ingenious dance, the kind that is called a spoken dance. It consisted of 8 nymphs, divided into 2 lines. At the head of one was the god Cupid, and at the head of the other, Interest, the former adorned with wings, a bow, and a quiver of arrows, the latter dressed in richly colored silks and gold. The nymphs who followed Love had their names written on white parchment in large letters on their back. Poetry was the name of the first, Discretion the name of the second, the third was called Good Lineage, and the fourth, Valor. Those who followed Interest were identified in the same fashion. Liberality was the name of the first, Gifts the name of the second, the third was called Treasure, and the fourth, Peaceful Ownership. At the head of all of them came a wooden castle drawn by 4 savages dressed in ivy and green-dyed hemp, and looked so natural they almost frightened Sancho. On the main facade of the castle and on all 4 of its sides was written, "The Castle of Caution." Their music was played on the timbrel and flute by 4 skilled musicians. Cupid began the dance, and having completed 2 figures, he raised his eyes and shot an arrow at a maiden standing on the parapets of the castle, saying, "I am a god most powerful, in the air and on the land, and the wide, wind-driven sea, and in the fiery pit, and the fearful hell it contains. Fear's something I've never known. Whatever I wish I can do, though it may well be impossible. In the realm of the possible, I rule, and give and take away at will." He finished the strophe, shot an arrow over the castle, and returned to his place. Then Interest came forward, and executed another 2 figures. The timbrels fell silent, and he said, "I am mightier than Love, though it is Love who guides me. I am of the finest stock, the best known and the noblest, that heaven breeds on earth. I am Interest, and for my sake few men do the deeds they should, though deeds sans me are miracles. I swear my devotion to you forever, world without end. Amen." Interest stepped back. Poetry came forward, and after performing her figures as the other had, she turned her eyes toward the maiden of the castle, and said, "In conceits most sweet and high, noble, solemn, and discreet, gentle Poetry, my lady, sends her soul to you in lines, found in 1,000 new sonnets. If my pleas and constant prayers do not weary you, your fortune, envied by so many damsels, will be raised on high by me to the circle of the moon." Poetry moved, and from the side where Interest stood, Liberality stepped forward, performed her figures, and said, "Liberality is the name of giving that shuns the extremes, of either prodigality or its opposite, the unwilling hand of a miserly soul. But in order to praise you, today I shall be prodigal, and though a vice, it is honored from a heart that is enamored, and in giving shows its love." In this fashion, all the dancers in the two bands came forward, and then withdrew, and each one performed her figures and said her verses, some of them elegant and some ridiculous. But Don Quixote could retain in his memory, which was very good, only those that have been cited. Then all the dancers mingled, forming pairs and then separating with gentle grace and ease. And when Love passed in front of the castle, he shot his arrows into the air, but Interest broke gilded money boxes against it. Finally, after having danced for some time, Interest took out a large bag made of the skin of a big Roman cat, which seemed to be full of coins, and threw it at the castle. And at the impact the boards fell apart and collapsed, leaving the maiden exposed and without any defenses. There is a note after skin of a big Roman cat, and it says, "Money bags were made of cat skin. Roman cats had a black and gray striped fur." Interest approached with the dancers in his group, put a long gold chain around her neck, and pretended to seize and subdue her and make her his prisoner. When Love and his companions saw this, they moved to free her, and all these displays were made to the sound of the timbrels as they danced and twirled in harmony. Savages imposed peace when they quickly set up and put together again the boards of the castle, and the maiden went back inside, concluding the dance that had been watched with great pleasure by the spectators. Exactly, Wadsworth. Don Quixote asked one of the nymphs who had composed and directed it. She responded that it was a cleric, a beneficiary from the village who had a great talent for these kinds of adventures. "I would wager," said Don Quixote, "that this beneficiary or bachelor must be more of a friend to Camacho than to Basilio, and that he is more inclined to writing satires than to saying his prayers at vespers. How well he has incorporated into the dance Basilio's skills and Camacho's wealth." Sancho Panza, who heard everything, said, "You are not ready for what Sancho says. My cock's king. I'm on Camacho's side." "Oh." And there is a note after king, and it says, "A phrase used to indicate which contender the speaker favored in a cockfight or in any other kind of contest." "In short," said Don Quixote, "it seems clear, Sancho, that you are a peasant, the kind who shouts, 'Long live whoever wins.'" "I don't know what kind I am," responded Sancho, "but I do know that I never get such fine skimmings from Basilio's pots as I've gotten from Camacho's." As he showed him the pot full of geese and chickens, and seizing one of them, he began to eat with great verve and enthusiasm. Sancho is a front runner. saying, "To hell with Basilio's talents. You're worth what you have, and what you have is what you're worth. There are only two lineages in the world, as my grandmother used to say, and that's the haves and the have-nots, though she was on the side of having. Nowadays, Senor Don Quixote, wealth is better than wisdom. An ass covered in gold seems better than a saddled horse. And so I say again that I'm on the side of Camacho, whose pots are overflowing with geese and chickens, hares and rabbits, while Basilio's, if they ever show up, and even if they don't, won't hold anything but watered wine." Sancho is the friend we all need. Yes, he at least tries. He tries so hard. "Have you finished your harangue, Sancho?" said Don Quixote. "I must have," responded Sancho, "because I see that your grace is bothered by it. If you hadn't cut this one short, I could have gone on for another 3 days." "May it please God, Sancho," responded Don Quixote, "that I see you mute before I die." "At the rate we're going," responded Sancho, "before your grace dies, I'll be chewing on mud, and then maybe I'll be so mute I won't say a word till the end of the world, or, at least, until Judgment Day." "Oh, Sancho, even if that should happen," responded Don Quixote, "your silence will never match all that you have said, are saying, and will say in your lifetime. Furthermore, it seems likely in the natural course of events that the day of my death will arrive before yours, and so I must think I shall never see you mute, not even when you are drinking or sleeping, which is what I earnestly desire." "By my faith, señor," responded Sancho, "you mustn't trust in the fleshless woman, I mean Death, who devours lamb as well as mutton. I've heard our priest say that she tramples the high towers of king as well as the humble huts of the poor. This lady is more powerful than finicky. Nothing disgusts her. She eats everything, and she does everything, and she crams her pack with all kinds and ages and ranks and people. She's not a reaper who takes naps. She reaps constantly and cuts the dry grass along with the queen, and she doesn't seem to chew her food, but wolfs it down and swallows everything that's put in front of her, because she's as hungry as a dog and it's never satisfied. And though she has no belly, it's clear that she has dropsy and is always thirsty and ready to drink down the lives of everyone living, like somebody drinking a pitcher of cold water." "Enough, Sancho," said Don Quixote at this point. "Stop now before you fall, for the truth is that what you have said about death is in your rustic terms, is what a good preacher might say. I tell you, Sancho, with your natural wit and intelligence, you could mount a pulpit and go around preaching some very nice things." "Being a good preacher means living a good life," responded Sancho, "and I don't know any other theologies." "You do not need them," said Don Quixote, "but I cannot understand or comprehend how, since the beginning of wisdom is the fear of God, you, who fear a lizard more than you fear him, can know so much." "Señor, your grace should pass judgment on your chivalries," responded Sancho, "and not start judging other people's fear or bravery, because I fear God as much as the next man, and your grace should let me eat up these skimmings. All the rest is idle words, and we'll have to account for those in the next world." And saying this, he resumed the assault on his pot with so much gusto that he awoke the appetite of Don Quixote, who, no doubt, would have helped himself if he had not been hindered by what must be recounted below. End of chapter 20. I love that Sancho is Team Camacho because he has food. He's like, "Ooh, I got some food. Team Camacho. Not Team Basilio. Team Basilio. Basilio has not fed me, so sorry." I can relate. I totally get it. I totally get it. All right. Chapter 21. A man of small things. Exactly. Simple pleasures in life. Chapter 21, which continues the account of the wedding of Camacho, along with other agreeable events. While Don Quixote and Sancho were engaged in the conversation described in the previous chapter, loud shouts and a great noise were heard from the men on mares, for with a huge outcry they galloped to receive the bride and groom, who were arriving in the midst of 1,000 different kinds of musical instruments and inventions, accompanied by the priest and their families, and the most distinguished people from the neighboring villages, all of them dressed in their finest clothes. As soon as Sancho saw the bride, he said, "By my faith, she isn't dressed like a peasant girl, but like an elegant lady. By God, as far as I can tell, the medallions she's supposed to be wearing are made of fine coral, and her green cloth from Cuenca is 30-pile velvet." And there are two notes in that sentence. After medallions, it says, when they married, peasant women usually wore a medallion with religious images on it. And then the second note is after 30-pile velvet, and it says, Sancho exaggerates to indicate the luxuriousness of the cloth. The warp of velvet normally was 2.5 pile. And then, just look at her hands adorned with jet rings. Damn me if they're not rings of gold, and really good gold, and set with pearl as white as curds, each one worth an eye at least, and damn me again for a whoreson, but that hair? If it's not a wig, I've never seen hair longer or blonder in all my life. No, nobody can say anything about her grace and form except to compare her to a swaying palm tree loaded down with dates, which is just what the jewels look like hanging from her hair and throat. I swear, she's as a fine, rosy-cheeked girl who can pass through the banks of Flanders. And there is a note after Flanders, and it's a long note. Buckle up. And it says, Martin de Ricoeur explains the reference as follows. Sancho's wordplay alludes to at least 3 different meanings for the phrase. The first refers to shifting sandbanks, making the phrase equivalent to passing safely between Scylla and Charybdis. The second alludes to the great Flemish banking houses. The third suggests the bank or benches made of a wood called Flanders pine, which the poor use as beds in central and southern Spain. Sancho, then, is saying that Quinteria is beautiful enough to pass through any danger, that she is going to marry a very wealthy man, and that she will soon come to her nuptial bed. Star, I was totally thinking the same thing. What a compliment. You look like a date tree tonight, let me just say. New pickup line. Oh my gosh. Don Quixote laughed at Sancho Panza's rustic phrase, though it seemed to him that aside from his lady Dulcinea of Toboso, he had never seen a more beautiful woman. Fair Quinteria, I keep adding an N in her name. There is no N in her name. Fair Quiteria seemed somewhat pale, and it must have been because of the sleepless night that brides always experience as they prepare for their wedding on the following day. The wedding party was approaching a stage on one side of the meadow, adorned with carpets and bouquets of flowers, where the marriage would take place, and from which they would watch the dances and dramatic inventions. And as they reached this spot, they heard shouts behind them, and one voice cried out, saying, "Wait a little. You who are as thoughtless as you are hasty." Please do. Please do, Star. I'm waiting with bated breath. Just put it in the pocket and wait for the right moment. At these shouts and words, everyone turned around and saw that the one who had called out was a man dressed, apparently, in a black cassock, decorated with fiery red strips of cloth. He was crowned, as they later saw, with a wreath of funeral cypress, and in his hands he held a large staff. As he came closer, everyone recognized the gallant Basilio, and everyone was in suspense, waiting to see the outcome of his shouts and his words, and fearing the worst from his appearing at this time. At last he stopped, tired and breathless, before the bride and groom, and thrust his staff, which had a steel tip at one end, into the ground. His color changed. He fixed his eyes on Quiteria, and in a hoarse, trembling voice he said, "You know very well, O forgetful Quiteria, that according to the holy laws which we profess, as long as I am alive you cannot take a husband, and you are not unaware that, as I waited for time and my diligence to improve my fortune, I have not failed to maintain the decorum that your honor demanded. But you, turning your back on all the obligations you owe to my honest desires, wish to make another the lord and master of what is mine, for his riches bring him not only good fortune, but even greater happiness. And so, it fill his cup of joy to the brim, not because I think he deserves it, but because heaven wishes to grant it to him. I, with my own hands, will take down the obstacle or impediment that may hinder him by removing myself from the scene. Long live rich Camacho, and with the thankless Quiteria. May he live many long and happy years, and death to poor Basilio, whose poverty cut the wings of his contentment and sent him to his grave." So my interpretation of that in the hoarse, trembling voice sounded much more like a smoker, like a lady smoker who has just been smoking several packs a day for many years. And saying this, he seized the staff that he had thrust into the ground, and leaving half of it in the earth, he showed that it served as a sheath for a medium-sized sword that was hidden inside, and after placing what he called the hilt in the ground, with swift agility and resolute purpose, he threw himself on it, and in a moment the bloody tip emerged from his back, along with half the steel blade, and the unhappy man lay on the ground, bathed in his own blood, and run through his own weapon. I was not ready for that. His friends hurried over to help him, grief-stricken at his misery and his pitiable misfortune. Leaving Rocinante, Don Quixote hurried to help him and took him in his arms, and discovered that he had not yet expired. Some wished to remove the sword, but the priest, who was present, thought it should not be withdrawn until he had heard his confession, because as soon as it was removed he would die. But Basilio began to revive, and in a faint, sorrowful voice he said, "If you should wish, O cruel Quiteria, to give me your hand in marriage in my final dying moment, then I think my temerity might find forgiveness, for with it I achieved the good of being yours." When the priest heard this, he took him to attend to the well-being of his soul rather than to the pleasures of his body, and to beg God very sincerely to pardon his sins and act of despair. To which Basilio replied that under no circumstances would he make his confession until Quiteria gave him her hand in marriage, that joy would strengthen his will and give him the courage to confess. Don Quixote, hearing the request of the wounded man, said in a loud voice that Basilio was asking for something very fair and reasonable, and, moreover, very easy to do, and that Señor Camacho would be just as honored receiving Señora Quitera as the widow of the valiant Basilio, as if he had received her from her father's side. Here, only one vow would be made, and its only effect will be the saying of it, for the nuptial bed of this marriage will be the grave. Camacho heard all of this, and all of this confused and baffled him, and he did not know what to do or say. But the voices of Basilio's friends were so clamorous, asking him to consent to Quiteриa's giving her hand to Basilio, so that his soul would not be condemned by living his life in despair, that he was moved, perhaps even forced, to say that if Quiteria wished to do so, then he was content, for it meant delaying only for a moment the fulfillment of his desires. Then they all turned to Quiteria, and some with pleas, and others with tears, and still others with persuasive arguments, urged her to give her hand to poor Basilio. She, as hard as marble and as motionless as a statue, showed that she could not, and would not, and did not wish to say a word, and she would not have responded at all if the priest had not told her to decide quickly what she was going to do, because Basilio's soul was between his teeth, and there was no time for her to be irresolute or indecisive. Then fair Quiteria, without saying a word, but perturbed and apparently sad and sorrowful, went toward Basilio, whose eyes were turned up, and whose breath was quick and hurried, and who was whispering to himself the name of Quiteria, giving every indication that he would die like a heathen and not a Christian. Finally, when she reached him, Quiteria fell to her knees and signaled for his hand, not asking for it with words. Basilio rolled down his eyes and looked at her intently. He said, "Oh, Quiteria, you have become merciful at a time when your mercy will serve as the knife that finally ends my life. For I no longer have the strength to bear the glory you have given me by choosing me for your own, or to hold back the pain that so quickly covers my eyes with the fearful shadow of death. What I implore, oh, my fatal star, is that you not ask for my hand nor give me yours out of a sense of duty, or to deceive me again, but because you confess and admit that of your own free will you give and present it to me as your legitimate husband. For it is not right that you deceive me at a moment like this, or use any pretense with one who has been so truthful with you." As he said these words, he fainted, and all those present thought that each time he fainted his soul would be carried away. Quiteria, filled with modesty and embarrassment, took Basilio's right hand in her own, and said, "No power is strong enough to turn my will, and so, with the freest will I have, I give you my hand as your legitimate wife, and I receive yours, if you give it to me of your own free will, unclouded and unchanged by the calamity your hasty action has brought you to." "I do," responded Basilio, not clouded, not confused, but with the clear understanding it has pleased heaven to give to me. "And so I give myself and surrender myself to you to be your husband." "And I give myself to be your wife," responded Quiteria, "whether you live for many long years, or are taken now from my arms and carried to your grave." "For someone who's so badly wounded," said Sancho Panza, "this young man certainly talks a lot. They should make him stop his courting and pay attention to his soul, which, in my opinion, is more on his tongue than between his teeth." Then, as Basilio and Quiteria held hands, the priest, tender-hearted and weeping, gave them his blessing, and asked heaven to rest the soul of the newly-wed husband, who, as soon as he had received the blessing, leaped with great agility to his feet, as he had received the blessing. Oh. I mixed two lines up. Hold up. We're going to start that sentence over. Then, as Basilio and Quiteria held hands, the priest, tender-hearted and weeping, gave them his blessing, and asked heaven to rest the soul of the newlywed husband, who, as soon as he had received the blessing, leaped with great agility to his feet, and with remarkable ease pulled out the sword that had been sheathed in his body. All the onlookers were astonished, and some of them, more simple-minded than inquisitive, began to shout, "A miracle! A miracle!" But Basilio replied, "Not a miracle, but ingenuity, ingenuity." The priest, confused and bewildered, hurried to touch the wound with both hands, and he discovered that the blade had passed not through the flesh and ribs of Basilio, but through a hollow metal tube filled with blood, which he had carefully placed there, as if it was later learned he had prepared the blood so it would not congeal. In short, the priest, Camacho, and all the bystanders considered themselves fooled and deceived. The bride showed no signs of regretting the trick. Rather, when she heard someone say that the wedding, because it had been deceitful, could not be valid, she said that she confirmed it again. Everyone concluded that she had known about and consented to the ruse, and this so angered Camacho and his companions that they took their vengeance into their own hands, unsheathed many swords, and attacked Basilio, and in an instant almost as many swords were drawn in his defense. And at their head rode Don Quixote, who, with his lance at the ready and his shield on his arm, forced everyone to make way for him. Sancho, who never took pleasure or solace from such exploits, took refuge among the cauldrons, where he had made his happy skimmings, for he thought the place was sacred, and had to be respected. Don Quixote, in a great voice, shouted, "Hold, señores, hold, for it is not right to take revenge for the offences that love commits. You should know that love and war are the same, and just as in war it is legitimate and customary to make use of tricks and stratagems to conquer the enemy, so in the contests and rivalries of love, the lies and falsehoods should used to achieve a desired end are considered fair, as long as they do not discredit or dishonor the beloved." Quiteria belonged to Basilio, and Basilio to Quiteria. By the just and favorable disposition of heaven, Camacho is rich and can buy whenever and wherever and whatever he desires. Basilio has only his sheep, and no man, no matter how powerful, can take her from him. Those whom God has joined let no man put asunder, and if any wishes to try, he will first have to pass by the point of this lance. And saying this, he brandished his lance with so much strength and dexterity that he filled all who did not know him with fear. Quiteria's disdain was fixed so firmly in Camacho's imagination that in an instant he erased her from his memory, and so he was persuaded by the arguments of the priest, a prudent, well-intentioned man, and he and his supporters were calmed and appeased, and to indicate this they returned their sword to their sheaths, blaming Quiteria's compliance more than Basilio's ingenuity. And Camacho reasoned that if Quiteria truly loved Basilio as a maiden, she would also love him as a married woman, and that he thought to give thanks to heaven for taking her away instead of giving her to him. Since Camacho and his followers were consoled and appeased, all of Basilio's supporters became calm, and rich Camacho, in order to show that he did not resent the trick or consider it of any importance, decided that the celebration should go on as if he really had been married. But Basilio and his wife and their followers did not wish to attend, and so they went to Basilio's village, for poor men who are virtuous and intelligent can also have people who follow, honor, and assist them, just as the wealthy have those who flatter and accompany them. They took Don Quixote with them, deeming him a man of great valor and courage. Only Sancho's soul was full of gloom when they found it impossible to stay for Camacho's splendid food and celebrations, which would go on until nightfall. And so, wretched and sad, he followed his master, who was riding away with Basilio's party, and left behind the cauldrons of Egypt, though he carried them in his heart, and his almost entirely consumed and eaten skimmings, which he carried in the pot, represented for him the glory and abundance of the good he was losing, and so, grieving and pensive, though not hungry, and without dismounting the donkey, he followed in Rocinante's footsteps. And that is the end of chapter 21. What a wild wedding! What a wild wedding! And they're still celebrating, even after Basilio's ingenuity. Wow. Wild. Do we think that she knew that this was all happening? Or did he just not, or did Basilio just not tell Quiteria and it was just a surprise, a pleasant, happy surprise that he didn't actually die? I don't know. But I would love to be a spectator at a wedding as dramatic as that. I don't want to be involved in something like that, but I would love to see something like that happen. Do we think that any of this is actually happening? It's all a simulation. They're all dreaming. We've had lions, Zorro, and a lavish wedding. What an evening with Moog and Don Quixote. Just a typical evening, you know? Just a typical evening. Oh, so wild. You mean that Don Quixote could certainly be dreaming? Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. 'Twas all but a dream. Also, I read DQ not as Don Quixote first, but as Dairy Queen. And let me tell you, I do dream of Dairy Queen. Red Talis, thank you so much for the hydrate. Absolutely. Sancho is amazing at finding food. Now I want a blizzard. Thanks. Mm. Yeah, that was an exciting one tonight. There was so much. So much. We're getting so good. This is like the size of like a normal book. We have a normal book size to go still. You can get any flavor of ice cream in your blizzard. You just have to ask. Amazing. Thank you for that. Thank you. Oh, all right. Well, that is going to be it for tonight. We did it. We are on page 597. And we got a long way to go. Oh, that was fun. Yeah. This one, this chunk, so fun. So much action packed. Action packed here and there. And it was not interrupted by one novel. And I feel like people are less and less telling their whole life story. And when we do get people's like whole life stories, like when we got what's his name? Don Diego's story. His story was more, yeah, I got a kid who loves poetry. I like to hunt. I live in this village, you know, that sort of thing. There is 940 pages. Yeah. So we got some pages to go. I know, I know. Well, and like this edition doesn't have any pictures, and the ones with pictures have over 1,000 pages. Monster. Monster. Oi. So, yes, that is gonna be it for tonight. We will pick up right where we left off next week. So, thank you all so much for joining. This was fun. This was a fun one. I hope you all have a great rest of your evening, and I hope to see you very soon. As always, oh my gosh, I like forgot what I usually say at the end. As always, whether you lurk, whether you chat, thank you so much for being here. I 1000% appreciate your support, and I 1000% appreciate you. And I will see you all very, very soon.